Welcome back, my friend. I hope you're doing well. Before we begin tonight's story, please leave a like and drop a comment. My goal is to reach 2,000 likes and 2,000 comments, and your support means a lot. Thank you for being here and supporting the channel. Now sit back, relax, and let's begin. The drive up Forest Road 816 takes 40 minutes from the Pisgah Ranger District office when the road is in good shape. After the August rains, it takes closer to an hour. I arrived at the Ivester Gap Trailhead parking area at 6:14 a.m. on October 4th. Backed the truck in as protocol requires and sat for a moment with the engine idling while I reviewed the assignment sheet one more time. My name is Daniel Merritt. I'm 38 years old. I've been working backcountry patrol and wildlife monitoring in the southern Appalachians for 14 years, the last 9 specifically within Pisgah National Forest's more remote sectors. Before that, I did 2 years as a seasonal ranger in Shenandoah, 1 summer fire season in Monongahela, and a brief fellowship placement with the USFS Wildlife Biology Division out of Asheville that gave me enough training and habitat assessment to qualify for dual classification work. I'm not a biologist by formal education, but I carry the field certifications, and I know these ridges the way a person knows their own street. I know which hollows hold fog longest. I know which creek sections run black in October from the tannins in the dead oak leaves. I know the way sound moves between the eastern and western slopes, how it flattens and distorts depending on wind direction and valley shape. The assignment was a combined patrol and assessment job, initiated after a series of logged complaints from the previous 3 weeks. 2 independent parties, a pair of section hikers and 1 solo day-use visitor, had reported to the district office that a stretch of the Art Loeb Trail between the Shining Rock Wilderness boundary and the Daniel Ridge Junction was showing significant storm damage. Blowdowns, washed-out tread, a reported section of collapsed drainage that had taken out approximately 30 feet of maintained trail surface. The district trail crew was already behind schedule after the August events, and backcountry patrol coverage for Sector 9 had been inconsistent since Marcus Webb transferred to the grandfather district in September. I was the available option with the most familiarity with the terrain. Standard 5-day solo patrol. Assess the reported damage. Photograph, GPS tag and document. Log wildlife sign for the ongoing beach scale monitoring program. Check the condition of the 2 emergency shelters in the sector, the lean-to at Cold Mountain Gap and the enclosed structure at the upper end of Farlow Gap Trail. File daily radio check-ins at 7 a.m. and 5 p.m. Return to the trailhead by October 9th. I've done more than 100 solo patrols in this range. I don't say that to establish bravado. I say it because it matters for understanding what follows. That what I noticed and what I documented was noticed and documented by someone who does not have a history of misreading terrain or catastrophizing routine observations. I have, in 14 years of fieldwork, filed 2 formal unusual occurrence reports. Both were later attributed to explainable causes. I am not someone who reaches for anomaly when exhaustion or weather or topography will serve equally well as explanation. I want that stated clearly at the outset. At 6:14 a.m., the parking area was empty except for my truck. The sky above the ridgeline was still purple-gray. The temperature reading on the dash said 44 SF, and there was a light northwest wind moving through the gap that carried the smell of damp spruce and the particular sweetness of October leaf fall. Beech and yellow birch and the occasional burst of something sharper, probably yellow poplar, still holding a few leaves on the lower slopes. I finished my thermos of coffee, did my gear check, pack weight confirmed at 42 lbs with the extra equipment for the shelter assessment, and started up the trail at 6:31 a.m. First entry in the field notebook, October 4, 0631. Clear start. Wind NW 8 to 10 mph. Temp 44 F. Visibility good. Entering Sector 9 via Ivester Gap, heading east-southeast toward Shining Rock. No issues at trailhead. The first 2 hours were unremarkable in all the right ways. The Art Loeb Trail in this section runs along a ridge at roughly 5,800 to 6,000 feet before dropping through a series of tight switchbacks toward the creek systems that drain east into the Davidson River corridor. The spruce fir zone up top had the characteristic morning stillness of late season, red squirrels active in the canopy above the maintenance road junction, A pair of ravens calling from somewhere beyond Shining Rock Ledge. The distant knocking of a pileated woodpecker moving along the dead snags in the beach gap about a quarter-mile off the main tread. I'm noting these sounds specifically because they matter later. The presence of all of them, the ravens, the woodpecker, the squirrels, indicated a functioning acoustic environment. That's not language I would normally use, but context changes what you choose to record. The first blowdown was at mile marker 1.4 from the gap, exactly where the section hikers had noted it. A mature red spruce, maybe 18 inches dBH, across the tread at chest height. The root ball had taken a section of the upslope drainage ditch with it, which meant the trail surface for about 20 feet downslope was now receiving uncontrolled water flow. I photographed, measured, GPS tagged the location at 35.9871 N, 82.7634 W, and noted the clearing work as a Category 3 maintenance priority, a two-person crew with a crosscut, probably half a day's work. The root ball would need a different assessment. Moving it wasn't feasible without equipment. I logged the option of a routed bypass. There were two smaller blowdowns before the Shining Rock Wilderness boundary marker, both crossing the tread, both smaller diameter, both manageable with hand tools. I photographed all of them and continued east-southeast. At 8:47 a.m. I reached the section that had been described as the collapsed drainage. The tread here ran across a south-facing slope at about 5,600 feet, and the drainage crossing, a simple culvert installation probably put in during the 1990s rehabilitation work, had failed completely. The culvert itself was visible about 30 feet downslope, carried there by whatever volume of water had moved through during the August rain events. The trail surface above it had dropped, not dramatically but visibly, a concave depression maybe 2 feet deep and 12 feet across where the subsurface had washed out from beneath the tread. The edges were still soft. I probed them with a trekking pole before stepping anywhere close. I spent 40 minutes at this location, photographed from 5 angles, took GPS coordinates for both endpoints of the damaged section and the location of the displaced culvert, made notes about the approach grades and my rough assessment of what a repair would require: excavation, culvert replacement or removal in favor of a stone and mortar ford construction, surface rebuilding. This was a Category 1 maintenance priority. The trail was functionally impassable here for low-skill users, and the washout was still actively eroding with each rain event. By 10:15 a.m., I had cleared the damaged section and was moving through the lower portion of the sector, heading toward my planned first-night campsite near the headwaters of a small, unnamed tributary of Farlow Creek. I've been calling it Rib Branch on my own maps for years, though I don't believe it has an official name. The site is sheltered, has reliable late-season water, and sits at a flat elevation of around 4,400 feet with reasonable protection from the northwest wind. Nothing about the morning warranted documentation beyond the standard maintenance observations. I ate lunch at 11:30 sitting on a boulder at the edge of a heath bald, looking southwest toward the main ridge. The sky had gone from clear to a light overcast between 9 and 10, and by midday the cloud ceiling was sitting at about 5,500 feet, low enough to obscure the upper portion of the ridge but high enough that visibility across the balds was still several miles. The wind had picked up slightly. I noted a 10% chance of afternoon showers in my weather log and adjusted my movement to ensure I reached camp before any precipitation materialized. I reached Rib Branch at 2:43 p.m., set up camp, tent, bear hang for the food bag, water filter setup at the creek, notebook review. Made my 5 p.m. radio check-in from camp, which went through clearly on the district frequency. Ranger Brenda Hollis at the district office confirmed receipt, noted there were no changes to the patrol parameters, and reminded me that the forecast for October 6th showed a frontal system moving in from the southwest with potential for sustained rain. I confirmed I had the full forecast and signed off. Evening was quiet. I boiled water for a freeze-dried meal at 6:30 p.m., documented the day's observations in the field notebook by headlamp, and was in the tent by 8:15 p.m. Temperature had dropped to around 36 FF. The wind was audible through the spruce canopy but not excessive. From the tent I could hear the creek about 40 feet away, running lightly over the rock bed. A clean, continuous sound with the slight unevenness of shallow water over cobble. I slept well. I note that specifically because it becomes a relevant baseline. October 5th. Up at 5:30 a.m. Temperature 32 FF, light frost on the tent fly. Sky still overcast, but the cloud deck had lifted slightly overnight. Visibility toward the ridge looked better than the previous evening. I did my gear check. Filtered 2 liters of water from the creek, made instant coffee on the stove, and had my 7 a.m. radio check-in completed by 7:03. The Hollis voice was slightly degraded that morning, a faint static undercurrent that I attributed to the overcast. This happens frequently in the sector. The district antenna is line of sight, and the ridges between here and the office create a lot of dead zones at lower elevations. I was at 4,400 feet, which is usually adequate for communication, but moisture in the atmosphere affects signal propagation in ways that aren't always predictable. The conversation was brief and functional. I noted the frost and the changed cloud conditions. She noted no new updates to the assignment. We signed off at 7:06. My second day's objective was the western branch of the sector, a stretch of the Farlow Gap Trail that climbs from around 3,200 feet at the lower trailhead to approximately 5,040 feet at the gap itself, through terrain that includes 2 creek crossings and a significant section of old logging corridor that the trail follows for about 6/10 of a mile. There had been no specific complaints about this section, but it was within my patrol area, and the August rains had likely hit the creek crossings hard. I broke camp at 7:45 a.m. and started east toward the Farlow Gap Trail junction, following my GPS track from the previous afternoon to navigate the quarter-mile of unmarked terrain between Rib Branch and the maintained trail system. At 8:12 a.m., I heard the first thing worth noting. I was moving through a section of dense rhododendron on a faint use path that connects the campsite area to the main trail. The rhododendron here forms tunnels, the canopy locks overhead, and the light goes from normal to green filtered within about 3 steps, and the acoustics change immediately. Sound deadens. Your own footsteps, your own breathing, even the movement of your pack straps become noticeably more present because the ambient forest sounds disappear behind the leaf mass. I had stopped to check my compass bearing. The use path turns twice in this section and it's easy to drift. When I heard something that I initially categorized as a large animal moving through brush, the sound was brief. 3 or 4 heavy contacts, spaced unevenly, approximately 40 yards to the south-southeast. My immediate thought was a black bear. October is late-season feeding time, and this section of the forest has a documented bear population that uses the rhododendron thickets for bedding. I clapped twice and called out. Standard protocol. I waited 30 seconds and heard nothing further. I noted it in the log as 0812. Possible bear movement in rhododendron thicket, SE of position approximately 40 IDs. Sound 3-4 heavy contacts, brush movement. Called out, no further activity. Continued east. What I didn't note at the time, and what I'm noting now, in this final documentation, is something small and possibly meaningless. The sound came from the south-southeast. But the wind that morning was from the northwest. A large animal moving through heavy rhododendron from that direction, in that wind, would typically have presented some scent indication. Black bears in particular are animals you often smell before you hear or see. I noticed the absence of any scent at the time, but assigned it to the density of the vegetation, the temperature, the fact that I was in a low spot, and scent behavior in compressed terrain is unpredictable. I mention it now only because it was the first small thing I noticed and dismissed. I reached the Farlow Gap Trail at 8:24 a.m. The junction was marked with the standard brown post marker, leaning slightly north, probably from a root heave, something to note for the trail crew. I turned south-southwest and began the descent toward the first creek crossing. The morning continued without incident. The first creek crossing, about 1.1 miles from the junction, was intact but narrowed. The high water had deposited a sand and gravel bar on the upstream side that slightly altered the approach angle, but the stepping stones were still serviceable. I crossed without incident and photographed the deposition for the maintenance log. The old logging corridor section was in better shape than I expected. The old roadbed is 10 to 12 feet wide, and the existing drainage structures, mostly simple broad-based dips cut into the road surface, had handled the August flows without significant damage. I noted one spot where the uphill cut slope had slowed a minor amount of material onto the road surface. but it was passable and would clear with one person and a Pulaski in less than an hour. By 11:30 a.m. I had reached Farlow Gap itself and sat for a rest at the saddle. The wind was steady from the northwest, temperature around 46 FF, the sky a uniform gray that gave the upper canopy a flat, shadowless look. From the gap you can see northeast toward the main ridge and southwest down into the Tuckasegee drainage. Both views were obscured by cloud cover. I ate, drank, checked the GPS. Current position 35.3147 gra N, 82.8891 gra W, elevation 5,042 feet. I cross-referenced against the paper topo in my pack, the Forest Service 124,000 quad for this area. The position tracked correctly. The descent back toward the lower trailhead was uneventful. I retraced my route along the logging corridor, made the creek crossing again, and began the climb back north toward the junction. I planned to reach camp by 3:30 p.m., giving me time before dark to assess the condition of the shelter near the upper end of the trail system. I reached the junction at 2:17 p.m., turned north. At 2:31 p.m. I stopped. The section of trail between the Farlow Gap Junction and the area where the use path connects to my campsite is a stretch I had walked twice that morning, once heading south at 8:12 and once earlier when approaching from the north. I knew the section. Two slight curves, one area of exposed route crossings where the tread narrows, a short ascent over a rocky step, then the junction with the use path marked by a cairn of 3 stacked flat rocks. At 2:31 p.m., I was standing at a point on the trail that I recognized, or believed I recognized, as approximately 2/10 of a mile south of the use path junction. And yet, the cairn was visible, not ahead of me where it should have been. To my left, off the trail maybe 8 feet into the forest, sitting on a flat shelf of exposed rock that I did not remember there being a flat rock shelf on. I stood there for what my watch later told me was 4 minutes. I was looking at a cairn of 3 flat rocks on a shelf of exposed rock, approximately 8 feet left of the trail. I walked to it, photographed it. The stones were the right ones. I had made that cairn myself 2 years ago, and I recognized the particular piece of reddish quartzite that sits on top. It's unmistakable. There is not a second piece of reddish quartzite in that specific shape anywhere on this section of trail. The rock shelf was real. The trees around it were real. The cairn was in the right condition, undisturbed, weathered, the top stone showing the same lichen growth I had noted previously. I stood there and thought through the possibilities methodically. I had drifted slightly off the main trail without noticing. The trail itself bent in a way that placed this feature to my left rather than ahead. I had simply misremembered the geometry of this section. It was the second day of the patrol and I hadn't walked this exact stretch in 2 months. And human spatial memory is imprecise even when you think it isn't. I checked my GPS. 35.3198 Dakota N, 82.8734 W. I pulled the paper topo and compared. The position placed me on the trail, within reasonable GPS error margin, approximately where I expected to be. The cairn was where the cairn was. I noted it in the log as a possible trail drift, that I had possibly stepped off the tread without realizing it, and continued north to camp. I set up at the Rib Branch site again, completed the evening routines, made my 5 p.m. check-in. I did not mention the cairn to Hollis. October 6th, 5:45 a.m. wake. Temperature 29 FF, frost heavier than the previous morning, the tent fly rigid in spots. The sky to the northeast was clear and pale orange above the ridgeline. The front that Hollis had mentioned was still incoming, but the morning had the clean, pressed look of clear weather ahead of a weather system. Good light, sharp shadows, sound carrying well. The 7 a.m. check-in came through cleanly. Hollis confirmed the front was expected to arrive midday on October 7th, with rain likely through the morning and tapering by afternoon. She asked about the drainage assessment. I gave her the summary. Category 1 damage at the collapsed culvert, 2 Category 3 blowdowns on the upper section, minor issues in the logging corridor. She acknowledged, noted it would go into the maintenance queue for the spring season at earliest. I signed off at 7:09. My third day objective was the Cold Mountain Gap Emergency Shelter and the ridgeline traverse that connects the upper Farlow Gap Trail system with the main Art Lobe corridor. This is the longest traverse in the sector, approximately 6.2 miles round trip from my camp, with an elevation gain of about 1,600 feet to the main ridge and a sustained descent on the north-facing slope toward Cold Mountain Gap. I wanted to start early to have adequate time at the shelter for a full assessment before returning to camp by late afternoon. I left camp at 7:30 a.m. The morning's first hour was as close to ideal Appalachian autumn conditions as I've experienced. Temperature rising from 29 ff toward the mid-40s, light northwest wind, the lower canopy still holding color, yellow birch and gold, cherry and rust orange. The occasional blood-red source that was probably a sourwood I couldn't identify from the trail. The bird activity was strong. I counted 3 species of thrushes moving through the understory within the first half mile, a flock of dark-eyed juncos in the beach gap at around 4,600 feet, and the persistent call of a white-breasted nuthatch somewhere ahead on the ridge. I noted all of this in the log, mostly out of habit, partly because of what I'd written about the acoustic environment on the previous morning. The climb to the main ridge is a consistent 12–15% grade for about 2 miles, through a mix of hardwood and spruce fir that transitions around 5,200 feet into the near-pure spruce zone. The trail tread was in reasonable condition, no major blowdowns, some erosion at the upper switchbacks that had been documented on a previous patrol and was still in the queue, a section of wet trail on the upper north slope where a seep crosses the tread. I logged the seep crossing as showing increased water volume compared to my last observation, but nothing beyond normal fall season levels. I reached the main ridge crest at 9:41 a.m. Elevation 6,029 feet. The wind on the exposed ridge was 15 to 20 miles per hour, cold and direct from the northwest, strong enough to require the shell jacket I had packed. The cloud ceiling was beginning to lower from the southwest, the leading edge of the forecasted front, probably 24 to 36 hours out. The ridge traverse is a section I know extremely well. In 9 years of Sector 9 patrol, I've walked it probably 40 times. The trail runs along the crest for 1.8 miles before descending the northeast face toward Cold Mountain Gap, passing through a series of heath balds interspersed with spruce and Fraser fir stands. The balds are the most exposed terrain in the sector. Wide open, no tree cover, visibility of several miles on a clear day. On October 6th, with the cloud ceiling at around 5,700 feet and the ridge crest at 6,029 feet, I was walking in and out of cloud base as I moved along the traverse. At 10:14 a.m., moving through the second heath bald, I stopped to check my GPS and cross-reference with the topo. I was at 35.9943 Dugra N, 82.8112 Dugra W, which placed me approximately 0.4 miles east of the trail junction with the unnamed ridge spur that leads to the old fire tower foundation. This was consistent with my elapsed time and pace. I move at about 2 mph on exposed ridge terrain in good conditions, and I had been on the ridge for 33 minutes. I noted the position, looked ahead along the bald toward where the trail re-enters the trees and thought, that's the first stand before the descent begins. I reached the first stand at 10:27 a.m. 13 minutes of walking, 0.4 miles in 13 minutes, which works out to about 1.85 mph. Reasonable for this terrain, but the GPS at 10:27 read 35.9961 Tupakwar N, 82.8089 Tupakwarja. I pulled the topo and cross-referenced. That position was not 0.4 miles from where I had been at 10:14. It was Tupakwar 2 miles. I stood at the edge of the first stand and looked back across the bald. The visual distance seemed right, maybe a quarter mile, maybe less. I did the math again. 13 minutes to cover 0.2 miles was a pace of about 0.9 mph. That was not right. I was carrying a 42-pound pack on level, open ridge, and even accounting for the wind, I don't move at under 1.5 mph unless I stop repeatedly. I hadn't stopped. I stayed at the first stand edge for a few minutes. The bald behind me looked the right size. The cloud base was close enough to feel it moving against my face. That particular wet coolness that isn't quite rain but isn't quite not. I looked at the GPS again. The position was stable and confirmed. I decided the most likely explanation was GPS drift or multipath error from the cloud moisture layer. GPS and cloud-based conditions on an exposed ridge with no tree cover can show positional errors of 40 to 100 meters, which would account for a discrepancy in position reading between the 2 points. I noted the discrepancy in the log under the heading Navigation and moved on. The descent from the ridge toward Cold Mountain Gap is a sustained drop of about 1,400 feet over 2.1 miles. North-facing slope, sheltered from the northwest wind once you drop below the crest, darker and wetter than the southern approaches. The tread here is mostly dirt over a clay substrate, tends to hold moisture and become slippery when wet. It was not wet today, but the clay was soft from recent precipitation, and my boot prints were pressing clearly into the surface. I noticed at some point in the descent that there were older boot prints in the same clay. This was not unusual. The sector does see occasional unauthorized overnight use, and this trail sees some section hiker traffic. But I noted it in the log because the print pattern was unusual. Only prints going downhill. Not downhill and uphill as you'd see from a hiker doing an out and back. Just downhill. I noted it in the log as possible unauthorized overnight use, boot prints in clay, end facing descent, downhill direction only, no corresponding return tracks. Size approximately US 910, no recent camping sign at Cold Mountain Gap. We'll check shelter. The shelter at Cold Mountain Gap was structurally intact. I spent 45 minutes doing the assessment. Roof, floor, structural members, door hardware, fire ring, food storage cable, signage. Noted 2 boards on the lower north wall that were showing decay and would need replacement within 2 seasons. Logged a list of minor maintenance items, found no evidence of unauthorized camping or fire use inside the shelter perimeter, found no boot prints continuing beyond the shelter in any direction. I ate lunch at the shelter, sheltered from the wind which was picking up as the afternoon progressed. Made notes, sat for a while. The Cold Mountain Gap area is a place I find genuinely peaceful. A wide saddle, some open sky above the gap itself, good views west in clear weather. It was not clear weather, but it was quiet. Bird activity at the gap, minimal. A single raven call from the East Ridge, far enough away to be ambiguous, otherwise nothing. The absence wasn't alarming. Bird activity decreases naturally ahead of frontal systems. I noted it in the log. Began the return climb at 1:47 p.m. The climb back to the ridge crest confirmed that I was walking correctly and that my pace was normal. I reached the crest at 3:12 p.m., 1 hour 25 minutes for 2.1 miles and 1,400 feet of gain. That's consistent with my standard performance on this section. I noted it in the log, partly to reassure myself that the discrepancy in the morning's readings had been instrument error, and partly because I had been paying attention to distance and time more consciously on the way back. The cloud ceiling had lowered during my time at the shelter. On the morning traverse, I had been moving in and out of cloud base. On the return traverse, I was solidly in it. Visibility across the balds had dropped from several miles to approximately 50 feet. The trail was visible directly ahead and behind, but the terrain on either side disappeared into gray-white fog within a few paces. I've worked in Appalachian fog many times. It is not a condition that bothers me. The trail tread is visible, the GPS is functioning, the compass works. I moved methodically, checking the trail markers, the square white blazes that mark the art lobe, at regular intervals. At 3:48 p.m., crossing the first of the 2 heath balds on the return, I heard a sound. It came from the south. And this is the imprecision that I keep returning to, from a direction that was either south or below the ridge to the south. In fog, with the ambient sound of wind through the heath and the occasional creak of stressed vegetation, directional attribution is genuinely difficult. I want to be precise about that. The sound was 3 impacts. Not quite knocking, not quite footsteps, more like the sound a heavy branch makes when it falls and contacts the ground, that initial thud and then the secondary rebound off the surface. 3 times, spaced about 4 seconds apart, then nothing. I stopped. I stood. The fog moved around me. Falling branches are common in Appalachian forest, particularly ahead of frontal systems when the wind increases and the trees begin to react. I was on an exposed ridge with little tree cover, but the south-facing slope below the ridge crest has a full hardwood canopy that I couldn't see through the fog. A branch falling in that canopy with the wind and the fog distorting the acoustic environment could easily present as something originating near me. I noted it and moved on. At 4:02 p.m., I reached the eastern end of the ridge traverse and began the descent toward my camp. Cloud base was sitting exactly at the ridge crest. I dropped below it within the first 50 feet of descent and visibility returned to normal, maybe 200 feet through the upper spruce. The wind decreased almost immediately, sheltered by the canopy. I was back at camp by 5:19 p.m., late. I had logged a total distance of 12.6 miles for the day, which was more than I had planned and accounted for my slower than usual return pace. The 5 p.m. check-in was technically late. I called at 5:22 p.m. Hollis was still on and acknowledged, noted the lateness without concern. I gave her the shelter assessment summary. She confirmed the frontal arrival was still expected for October 7th midday. At 5:24 p.m., during the final seconds of the check-in, the radio produced a brief interruption. A fragment of sound that I initially assumed was a third radio breaking into the frequency. This happens occasionally with the district repeater when multiple units are active, but it didn't sound like a radio transmission. It sounded like, and I am aware of how this will read, a voice, not words, the sound of a voice, a human voice without identifiable language. For perhaps 1.5 seconds, then Hollis's voice returned, asking if I'd gotten that, meaning the weather update. I said yes and signed off. I sat by the tent and wrote in the notebook for a while. The creek was audible. The wind in the upper canopy was audible. I noted the radio fragment as possible voice fragment on district frequency 1724, duration approximately 1.5 seconds. Likely third-party radio bleed or repeater artifact. No further activity. I cooked, ate, reviewed the day's documentation. The boot prints in the clay bothered me more than I had been letting myself acknowledge. Not because of what they suggested, but because of what they didn't suggest. If someone had walked down to Cold Mountain Gap, they had either returned by a different route, which would mean either the wilderness boundary trail or a complete bushwhack through the north-facing forest, or they had not returned at all, or they had returned on a surface that didn't hold tracks. Dry rock, or moss, or the upper leaf litter layer that sometimes recovers from prints within a few hours. Any of these was more likely than the alternative, which was no alternative worth writing down. I went to sleep at 8:45 p.m. The temperature inside the tent at that point was 34 FF. I kept my boots inside the sleeping bag stuff sack to prevent the leather from stiffening overnight. Outside, for a long while before I slept, I could hear the creek. I could hear the wind. And once, from somewhere east along the ridge, far enough away to be a complete guess, I heard what might have been a knock. 2 times. Or it might have been a woodpecker late in the evening or a branch settling in the wind. I did not write it in the log. I am writing it now. October 7th. The frontal system arrived 6 hours early. I woke at 3:11 a.m. to rain. Not rain exactly, but the sound of heavy moisture moving through the canopy, which at 3 a.m. in a forest is audibly indistinguishable from light rain until you check and find the tent fly is sheened rather than wet. Fog drip. The air was saturated and the trees were shedding it. By 4:30 a.m. it had transitioned to actual rain, steady and light, and by the time I had dressed and made coffee it was a moderate, consistent rainfall with occasional heavier cells moving through. The 7 a.m. check-in was badly degraded. Hollis's voice was present but with a constant static underlayer that made portions inaudible. I caught. Early arrival, confirmed, system expected to persist through midday possible. Station conditions, she couldn't get through. I acknowledged what I could and signed off. My objective for the day had been the upper section of the art lobe between the Daniel Ridge Junction and the Shining Rock boundary, the full damage assessment on the reported tread failures. I had planned to cover this in dry conditions. Rain changes trail assessment work significantly. Slopes become unstable. Photos are less useful. Your documentation accuracy decreases because you're managing gear and footing simultaneously, but it was the 3rd day of a 5-day patrol, and the weather wasn't forecast to be severe. I made the decision to continue. I left camp at 8:05 a.m. in full rain gear. The forest in sustained rain is a different acoustic environment. The percussion of water on leaves creates a continuous white noise that changes with the canopy structure. louder under mature hardwood crowns with large leaves, softer in the spruce where the needles break the drops into fine mist. You lose the secondary sounds, you lose the medium-range birds, you lose the small mammal movement that's usually audible in the leaf litter. You retain the creek noise, which increases in volume as the watershed absorbs and passes on the rainfall, and you retain the close sounds, your own footsteps, your rain jacket against the pack straps, your breathing. I was moving northeast along the Art Lobe when, at 8:47 a.m., I realized I was walking parallel to a sound. This requires some explanation. When you move through forest in the rain, the ambient sound is consistent in all directions. There's nothing directional about rain noise, but underneath the rain noise, on my right side, there was a rhythmic sound. Not constant, intermittent. It took me perhaps 40 steps to isolate it and understand what I was hearing. Footsteps, or rather, a sound with the temporal pattern of footsteps. Irregular but grouped. The spacing and weighting of someone walking over leaf-covered ground, about 30 to 40 feet to my right in the forest. I stopped immediately. The sound stopped. I stood for 60 seconds. Rain, wind, creek, the movement of wet branches, nothing else. I took 3 steps forward. The sound resumed briefly, 2 or 3 contacts, and then stopped again when I stopped. I moved off the trail to the right, into the forest, for about 20 feet. There was nothing visible. The slope fell away eastward through a stand of yellow birch, bare below about 15 feet. The trunks dark gray with rain moisture. The leaf litter was wet and matted from the rainfall. No boot prints visible, but wet compressed leaves don't hold prints clearly. I returned to the trail. The most logical explanation was acoustic. Rain falling on a slope creates subtle directional channeling effects, particularly where the canopy structure changes. And what I was hearing was likely a localized variation in rainfall pattern against the forest floor. This is a real acoustic phenomenon that I had read about in the context of wildlife sound monitoring. The human auditory system is pattern sensitive and will identify rhythmic groupings within irregular sounds. I noted it in the log. 0847. Possible acoustic artifact. Rhythmic sound, right of trail, intermittent, consistent with footstep pattern. Rain conditions, acoustic interference likely. Investigated briefly, no physical sign. Continued NE. I continued northeast. The Art Lobe Trail damage section was more extensive than the complaints had suggested. Beyond the 3 blowdowns and collapsed drainage I had already documented, there were 2 sections of severe tread erosion on the northeast-facing slope below Shining Rock Ledge. The kind of channeled erosion that forms when a trail becomes the primary drainage path during high-volume rainfall events. Both sections had cut down through the organic surface layer into the underlying mineral soil. One section was approximately 40 feet long with tread loss of 4 to 6 inches of depth. The other was shorter but showed active undermining at the lower edge. The tread surface was intact but hollow beneath it in spots I identified by the way it flexed under my boot. I spent 3 hours in the rain doing this assessment. My notebook was protected in a Ziploc, but removing it, documenting and returning it repeatedly in sustained rain is a slow and imperfect process. I took extensive photographs. The GPS track for this section would provide a useful record of the damage extent. By 12:30 p.m., I had completed the upper section assessment and was ready to head back. I had covered about 4.2 miles from camp and needed to return by the same route. I ate a quick lunch under the limited shelter of a large spruce overhang near the Shining Rock boundary marker. Standing rather than sitting because sitting on wet ground in sustained rain depletes your warmth reserves faster than movement. The rain had softened to a drizzle by this point, the heavier cells of the morning having passed. Visibility was better, maybe 150 feet through the trees rather than 50. While I was eating, I was looking south-southwest along the trail corridor. The Art Lobe here is a clear corridor. The tree canopy opens along the tread and you can see relatively well along the trail direction even in reduced visibility. I was looking down the trail for no particular reason, eating, standing. At approximately 12:41 p.m., at the edge of my visibility, something moved. I want to be careful here. What I saw was a displacement of visual texture, a brief change in the light pattern at the edge of my visibility range, perhaps 120 to 150 feet down the trail, It lasted perhaps 2 seconds and was most consistent with a large animal, a deer most likely, crossing the trail and re-entering the forest. Deer movement at this elevation in early October midday moderate rain conditions is entirely normal. I see deer on the Art Lobe regularly. I noted it in the log as 1241. Possible deer crossing, trail corridor. SSW approximately 130 feet 2 seconds. Rain, visibility limited. Normal wildlife behavior. I did not call out. I did not move toward it. I finished eating and began the return southwest along the trail. For the next mile and 20 minutes, I did not think much about any of it. I was focused on the trail surface, the weather, the sound of the rain, the logistics of the return. At some point around 1:15 p.m., I noticed that the rain had largely stopped and the dripping from the canopy was creating an irregular sound pattern that was almost indistinguishable from footsteps at about 30 yards. I noted this in the log. I also noted, and this is something I thought about for a long time before writing down, that I had been listening for footstep pattern sounds since that morning. That once you begin to hear a thing, you continue to hear it even when the thing is not there. This is not a mystery. This is how perception works. By the time I reached camp at 2:53 p.m., the rain had stopped entirely and the cloud ceiling was beginning to break. Shafts of afternoon sunlight were visible through the gaps, lighting the upper canopy in that specific golden quality you get when wet foliage catches direct light from a low angle. Everything was dripping. The forest smelled of wet earth and decay and something faintly sweet, the beginning of fermentation in the leaf pack, which starts immediately after the first real soaking of fall. I changed into dry base layers inside the tent, spread the rain gear on the tents outside to dry as much as possible in the remaining daylight, and sat by the creek for a while reviewing my notes. I had, by the end of day 3, accumulated more notations in the logs anomaly section than I had in any previous 5-day patrol. Not dramatic notations, small ones. The cairn displacement, the GPS distance discrepancy, the radio voice fragment, the rhythmic sound in the morning rain, the movement at the edge of visibility. Each of them individually had a ready explanation. Rain acoustics, GPS drift, radio interference, wildlife, misremembered spatial configuration. These were not unusual occurrences for backcountry work. They were the normal texture of 4 days alone in complex mountain terrain. But I was documenting them, and that itself was worth noticing. I've been keeping field logs for 14 years. I'm aware of my own documentation habits. I note unusual observations not because I believe they're significant, but because completeness is a professional standard. What I was aware of sitting by the creek was that I was documenting more than usual and with greater precision than usual. Each anomaly was getting more words than standard protocol requires. I was including sensory qualifiers, the smell or the absence of smell, or the precise quality of the visual distortion. I do not normally do this. I made a note about the note-taking, which sounds absurd, and I'm aware of that. The 5 p.m. check-in was clear. Hollis confirmed the front had passed. Forecast for October 8th was partly cloudy with temperatures back into the upper 40s. She asked how the assessment had gone. I gave her the summary of the damage on the Art Lobe section, 2 additional erosion features, possible tread collapse at the lower section. She noted it, asked if I needed anything. I said no. Signed off at 5:08 p.m. That evening I did something I don't usually do on patrol. I checked and rechecked my compass and GPS against each other and against the topo map for an extended period. Not because I had any doubt about my position. The GPS placed me consistently at 35.3871 km N, 82.8734 km W within +/- 5 meters over multiple readings. The compass bearing from camp toward the Art Lobe Junction tracked accurately against the topo's orientation. Everything was correct. I went to sleep at 8:30 p.m. At 11:43 p.m. I woke up. The forest was completely silent. Not quiet. Silent. The creek was not audible. The wind was not audible. The distant valley sounds that normally form the night baseline in an Appalachian forest, the small creek noises, the occasional calling owl, the sound of the mountain itself breathing, were entirely absent. I lay still for what felt like 2 minutes. I checked my watch. 11:43 p.m. I listened. The silence was total and specific. Not the silence of heavy snow which muffles. Not the silence of fog which dampens. A present, open silence, as if the sound had been actively removed rather than absorbed. At 11:51 p.m., I noted in the log, 23:51. Woke to complete absence of ambient sound. No creek noise, no wind, no wildlife. Duration at least 8 minutes as of this entry. No weather cause visible. Sky partially clear through the mesh. Stars visible. Temperature appears unchanged. At 11:58 p.m., the creek resumed. A sudden return to full volume, as if a switch had been toggled. The wind followed within 30 seconds. I did not sleep again for a long time. In the morning, I had several explanations ready. The most plausible was that I had woken in a hypnagogic state, the transitional period between sleep and waking, and was experiencing auditory suppression that is a documented feature of that state. The human brain can genuinely fail to process ambient sound during hypnagogic transitions. It's not hallucination, it's a processing gap. This was, I decided, what had happened. I noted this explanation in the morning log entry, beside the nighttime notation. I left the contradiction in both entries without resolving it. October 8th, clear, temperature 38 FF at 6 a.m. The sky above the ridge was a deep, saturated blue, the kind you only get after a substantial frontal passage has scrubbed the atmosphere. Every surface was still wet, and the sun, once it cleared the ridge at 7:15, lit the dripping forest into something almost luminous. I spent the 7 a.m. check-in asking Hollis about the sector's documented radio issues. She confirmed that Sector 9 has consistent degradation in the hollows and on the north-facing slopes, and that the district frequency occasionally picks up bleed from commercial operations on adjacent frequencies. She mentioned a forestry operation in the Toxaway drainage that had been using equipment radios on a nearby channel. This was a plausible source for the voice fragment I had heard. She also told me that there had been no reports of any other parties in the sector. No permit registrations for overnight use in the current week for Sector 9. She confirmed this without my asking. I had mentioned the boot prints on the previous check-in and she had evidently looked it up. No registered parties. The boot prints had come from someone without a permit, or someone who had entered at an unmapped access point, or from a date before my patrol began and I was misreading the track preservation in the clay. All plausible. I noted them. My fourth day objective was the lower sector, specifically the Daniel Ridge Trail and the access road system near the bottom of the watershed, which had been flagged for culvert inspection after the August events. This section required a descent of about 2,000 feet from my current camp elevation, which meant a significant morning descent and afternoon reascent if I planned to return to the Rib Branch campsite. I left camp at 7:45 a.m. The descent through the hardwood zone on the south-facing slope was easy and pleasant in the clear morning light. The trail here is well established. The tread is maintained to a high standard because it receives more day-use traffic, and the fall color at 3,500 to 4,200 feet was at or near peak, a wall of yellow and orange on the hillsides above the creek. The sound of the creek itself now at full autumn volume, swollen from the previous day's rain. I reached the Daniel Ridge Junction at 9:17 a.m., took a position fix, 35.28417 N, 82.92717 W, elevation 3,247 feet, checked the junction signage, intact and legible, continued south along the lower trail toward the first culvert crossing. The lower sector is a different world from the upper ridges, wetter, warmer, more human. There are informal social trails connecting the official network to the access road. Evidence of past campfire use at several creek-adjacent flat spots, the occasional piece of legacy debris, a rusted tin can, a fragment of wire fence from the logging era, a concrete footing from some structure that no longer exists. The forest here is younger, recovering from more intensive historical use, and the canopy is less continuous. There are light gaps, openings, a more varied structure that different species use differently. I was working through the culvert inspection. Third culvert on the route, marking it on the GPS, crouching down to photograph the invert. When I heard music, this is not ambiguous. This is not an acoustic illusion or a pattern recognition artifact. Music, distant, indistinct, but structured. The quality of it suggested a radio or a recorded source rather than an instrument, a tinny flatness in the upper frequencies that is characteristic of a small speaker. It was approximately 300 to 350 yards away to the southwest in the direction of the fire road that runs along the lower watershed boundary. I stood up and listened for about 2 minutes. The music continued, then stopped, then after perhaps 30 seconds returned briefly before stopping again. The access road does come within approximately a quarter mile of this location. A hiker with a Bluetooth speaker, a road crew, a vehicle parked at the gate. Any of these would account for the sound entirely. I continued the culvert inspection, noted the music cessation at around 9:48 a.m. and moved on. At 10:15 a.m. I reached the fire road boundary and walked along it for about 1/10 of a mile in each direction from the trail crossing. I saw no vehicles, no people, no evidence of recent activity at the trail/road junction. The road itself was wet and holding moisture in the tire width strips that form when vehicles pass. There were no recent tire tracks visible. The access gate was approximately 4 miles to the south. I walked to it. The gate was locked. The padlock was the district's standard padlock serial number on the tag matching the Sector 9 inventory. Undisturbed. No tire tracks approaching from the south. I noted 10:37. Music recorded/radio heard at Culvert Inspection 3. Direction SW. Duration intermittent. Approx 1845 seconds total. No source located at fire road boundary. Access gate confirmed locked. No vehicular sign. Source unknown. I don't know what to make of the music. I still don't. Sound carries in unusual ways in these valleys. The steep slopes and the creek corridors create channeling effects that can project sound from distant sources with surprising clarity and distance. There are residences and resort properties several miles to the west in the Brevard corridor. It's possible I was hearing something from that direction, channeled along the river valley and redirected upslope by the terrain geometry. It's possible, but what I keep thinking about is the stop-start quality of it. The way it recurred. A distant radio or speaker that stops and starts at irregular intervals has a mechanical explanation, someone adjusting it, or intermittent reception, or a playlist cycling. These things happen. I have no reason to prefer a different explanation. I began the return ascent at 11:30 a.m. The afternoon's ascent was harder than I expected. This is partly attributable to the accumulated fatigue of 3.5 days of sustained field work. 12+ miles on day 3, significant elevation work throughout, and partly, I think, to something less quantifiable. I was moving more slowly. I was stopping more often, not for physical reasons or not entirely. I was stopping to listen. I made note of this in the log at 2:14 p.m., at a rest break on the mid-slope switchbacks. The note says, observation, increased frequency of rest stops without physiological cause. Route is familiar, conditions are good. Assessment, heightened auditory attention affecting pace, will monitor. I've written incident reports for other rangers that included phrases like, showed signs of elevated stress response, and demonstrated atypical patrol behavior. I am aware of what those phrases mean in the context of this document, and I'm aware of how it reads to include them about myself, but the alternative, not documenting what I actually observed, seems worse. The field notebook is a legal document in some contexts and a professional record in all of them. I reached camp at 4:04 p.m., later than intended. I was tired in a way that was slightly out of proportion to the day's exertion. A bone-deep fatigue that I associate with high-altitude work or with sustained stress and which is different from the muscle tiredness of a hard hiking day. I sat by the creek for 20 minutes before starting camp tasks, something I wouldn't normally do. The 5 p.m. check-in went through clearly. I filed the culvert inspection results. Hollis confirmed my last day would be October 9th as planned and asked me to confirm my departure estimate. I gave her 2 p.m. at the trailhead, which allowed for a morning sweep of the upper section before descending. At 5:31 p.m., after signing off, I was refilling my water bottles at the creek when I noticed something that required 3 separate looks to interpret. The creek is running over a bedrock shelf at the point where I've been filtering water. A flat ledge of metamorphic rock, gray-green, about 4 feet wide, with the creek pouring over it in a smooth sheet. On this shelf, clearly visible in the late afternoon light, were several distinct impressions in the thin layer of sand and silt that had settled during the post-rain clearing. They were round, 8 or 10 of them scattered across the shelf. Not lined up, not patterned, just present. My first interpretation was animal prints, raccoon most likely, as the circular impressions were roughly paw-sized and raccoons are common in creek environments throughout the southern Appalachians. But raccoon prints have a distinctive shape, 5 elongated toes easily recognizable. These were simply round, deeply impressed into the silt but perfectly circular. My second interpretation was natural. Water dripping from a height will create circular depressions in soft sediment, as will individual water drops landing in still conditions. The creek shelf was exposed on the downstream side and could catch drip from the vegetation overhang above. I photographed the impressions. I did not step onto the shelf to measure them more precisely. I filled my water bottles, treated them, and returned to camp. I ate dinner. I reviewed all my notes from the patrol, in sequence from the first day. Sitting in the tent by headlamp, reading my own handwriting across 4 days of observations, I was struck by something that is difficult to articulate clearly. Each individual entry was reasonable. The explanations I had assigned to each anomaly were legitimate and realistic, but the sequence of them, the accumulation day by day of small, inexplicable things, created an impression that no single entry contained. A sense of increasing density, like the environment had been quietly rearranging itself around me by increments small enough to be explicable but large enough to be felt. I wrote one sentence at the bottom of the October 8th page. I don't know why I wrote it. It's not protocol language, and it's not the kind of language I use in field documentation. I wrote, "Something about this sector has changed, or I have." I looked at that sentence for a while and then I left it in. October 9th. Last day of the patrol. Up at 5 a.m. Temperature 41 FF. Wind calm, sky clear. The morning had the deep stillness that sometimes precedes or follows major weather. A held quality as if the air itself were paused. I made my 7 a.m. check-in, which went through clearly. Hollis confirmed my departure for 2 p.m. at the trailhead. I confirmed. Routine exchange. I signed off and broke camp. My final morning objective was the upper sector's remaining documentation gap. A section of the art lobe between my previous Day 3 endpoint near the Shining Rock boundary and the Avester Gap trailhead, which I had bypassed on Day 3 due to the rain. This section was lower priority but needed walking for completeness. I had approximately 5 miles to cover, including the descent to the trailhead, with a 2 p.m. departure target. That was achievable if I left by 8 a.m. and moved at a reasonable pace. I left at 8:07 a.m. The first mile was fine. The second mile was fine. The morning stillness had resolved into a very light, barely perceptible northeast breeze. Unusual wind direction for this area, where northwest and southwest dominate, but not remarkable. The bird activity was back to normal levels. The same species I had noted on Day 1, the same approximate distribution through the altitude zones. Everything had the quality of a reset, a morning that didn't remember what had preceded it. At approximately mile 2.3, moving along the main ridge section near the old fire tower foundation, I stopped to do a GPS check. 35.9961 Dakran N, 82.8 $89 W. Elevation 5,891 feet. I looked at those coordinates for a long time. 35.9961 Guard N, 82.8089 Guard W. That was the GPS position I had recorded on October 6th at 10:27 a.m. at the eastern edge of the first stand on the ridge traverse. I was standing in the morning of October 9th at a position that my instrument assigned to a location I had been 4.5 days ago. This was impossible if my route was what I understood it to be. I was approaching from the southwest from the trailhead direction, and I had not been on this section of ridge since October 6th. I stood there and worked through it carefully. GPS positional accuracy at this elevation on a clear morning should be within +3 meters. The positions should not match to 4 decimal places unless I was in exactly the same location or within a few feet of it. I looked around. The first stand was to my left. The heath bald was opening ahead. This was the same location, but my route for the morning, from camp to this point via the art lobe, should have placed me about a 1/4 mile northeast of here. I had been walking southwest to northeast. The fire tower foundation should have been to my right, not behind me. I checked the compass. The compass said north was north. The compass said I was facing east-northeast. The trail was running east-northeast. I turned around and looked back the way I had come. The trail ran west-southwest, as it should. I could see my boot prints in the soft trail surface for about 40 feet before the tread went over rock and lost them. Everything was oriented correctly. The compass was correct. The map was correct. The GPS coordinates were. There was simply no explanation I could reach for the fact that they matched the October 6th reading at this location. I checked the GPS track log and found that it showed my current morning's track as a continuous line from camp to here, with no anomalies. The position at the start of the track, at camp, matched the previous 4 mornings' camp position at Rib Branch. The track was coherent. The individual position reading was somehow identical to a position 4 days previous at the same terrain feature. I noted it in the log. I photographed the GPS screen. I moved on. The remaining distance to the Ivister Gap trailhead was straightforward on paper. 2.3 miles northeast along the Art Lobe, then a descent from the ridge to the parking area. I had walked this section dozens of times. In the right conditions, including that morning's clear weather, I can do it in under 2 hours. At 9:45 a.m. I was still on the ridge. According to my GPS, I had covered 1.8 miles since the fire tower foundation position. According to my pace count and elapsed time, I had covered approximately 2.1 miles. The discrepancy was in the wrong direction from what I'd experienced on October 6th. This time the GPS was showing less distance than my physical sense of movement, rather than more. I stopped and tried to find something to reconcile these numbers. The only explanation that worked for both the October 6th anomaly and this one was consistent GPS drift, a systematic error in positioning that was skewing all distance calculations. The GPS drift of this magnitude, on a clear morning at 5,800 feet with good satellite geometry, was outside anything I had experienced or read about in 15 years of field navigation. I noted it. I moved on. At 10:08 a.m. I reached the Eastern Trailhead approach, the final section of the Art Lobe before the descent to the parking area, a distinctive stretch of trail that runs through a grove of old-growth yellow birch. The trees so large their trunks have taken on the twisted, buttressed form that only develops after 2 or 3 centuries. This grove is one of the most recognizable features in the sector. I have photographed it many times. I know these trees. I entered the grove at 10:08 a.m. I should have been through it and at the start of the descent by 10:18 a.m., based on the grove's length of approximately a quarter mile. I exited the grove at 10:47 a.m., 39 minutes for a quarter mile. I stood at the grove's eastern edge and looked back into it. The birch trunks were receding in the morning light, massive and gray-white. The leaf cover, thick underfoot, deadened my footsteps. Looking back through the grove, I could see the trail corridor for perhaps 150 feet before it curved and disappeared. It had never seemed longer than that when I was in it. I checked my watch 4 times between 10:08 and 10:47 to be certain I was reading it correctly. I was. 39 minutes, I had not stopped. I had not sat down or rested. I had walked through a familiar quarter-mile grove that I have covered in under 8 minutes on previous patrols, and it had taken 39 minutes, and I did not know where the time had gone. I stood at the edge of the grove for a long time. The most available explanation was a dissociative episode, a period of automatic, low-attention walking in which time perception is disrupted. This is well documented in endurance athletes and in people operating under sustained fatigue and stress. It is sometimes called highway hypnosis in vehicle contexts. In field work, it's usually associated with long, repetitive travel days and sleep deprivation. I had not slept well on the nights of October 6th or 7th. I was on day 5 of a solo patrol with significant daily mileage. The stress indicators I had noted in my own log, the increased documentation, the stopping to listen, the accumulated sensory uncertainty, were consistent with moderate isolation-related stress effects. I accepted this explanation in the field, in the moment. I am noting it here in full, and I am also noting that I have never experienced a dissociative episode in 14 years of fieldwork, and I have been under conditions of more severe sleep deprivation and physical stress than the past 5 days. I noted in the log, 10:47. Exit Birch Grove. Entry 1008. 39-minute discrepancy. Possible dissociative walking episode, fatigue-related. No other physical cause identified. I began the descent to the trailhead. The descent took 45 minutes. Normal. No anomalies. The trail tread was standard. The elevation dropped as it should have. The parking area appeared at the bottom of the trail at the distance it should have appeared. My truck was where I had left it, backed in, with the permit tag still visible in the windshield. I reached the trailhead at 11:32 a.m. I had planned for 2 p.m. I sat on the tailgate and ate a full lunch and did not fully understand where the time had gone on the way out, but also didn't pursue it aggressively. I was done. I was out. The air at the parking area was 20 degrees warmer than the ridge, and the sun was direct, and the sound of the Pisgah forest from the parking area, the creek sounds, a distant truck on the highway corridor, someone's radio from a campsite somewhere down the road, was familiar and ordinary and grounding. I loaded the truck, secured the equipment, changed out of my field boots, and drove back to the district office. I made my final check-in by radio at 12:47 p.m. from the truck on FR 816. Hollis acknowledged and noted I was early. I said conditions had been good for the descent. I did not tell her about the Birch Grove timing. I had not, over the 5 days, told her about the cairn displacement, the GPS discrepancies, the rhythmic sounds, the voice fragment, the total silence, the boot prints, the music, the circular impressions in the creek sediment, or the feeling that had been building since day 2 that the sector I was walking through was not precisely the same sector that I had known and documented for 9 years. I told her the trail damage was documented, and she confirmed it would go into the queue. I signed off and drove down the mountain. Back at the district office, I filed the standard patrol report on October 9th, completing it before I left that afternoon. The report contained all the trail damage documentation, the shelter assessments, the culvert inspection, the wildlife sign observations from the beach scale monitoring program. It was a complete and accurate document within its scope. In the section marked Unusual Observations, I wrote, "None. I don't know why I did this. I have been trying to understand it since. The most honest answer is that I had been rationalizing the anomalies for 5 days, and by the time I sat down to write the report, the rationalizations had become the default entries in my memory. The GPS was drifting, the sounds were weather, the fatigue was real, and perceptual distortions are documented features of field isolation. Writing these things in the report, in an official document with my name and ranger identification attached, felt disproportionate to observations for which I had technically valid alternative explanations. I also did not feel ready to write them down in a way that committed them to record. There is a difference between the field notebook, which is a working document and a personal record, and the official patrol report, which becomes part of the sector file and is reviewed by supervisors and used to assess both the sector's conditions and the ranger's performance. I made a decision in the minutes I sat at the computer that I was not willing to have those observations evaluated officially without being able to articulate them more clearly. The field notebook, which contains everything, is in my possession. It has not been submitted. The district does not require notebook submission for standard patrol reports. I was reassigned to routine day patrol at the lower access corridors for the following week. A standard rotation, not anomalous, probably coincidental timing. I did not request the reassignment, but I also did not request a return to Sector 9. When Marcus Webb transferred back from Grandfather District 3 weeks later and resumed primary coverage of Sector 9, I was asked if I had any notes to pass on. I gave him a summary of the maintenance priorities. I said the sector was in generally good shape aside from the documented damage. I did not mention anything else. I have been going back to the field notebook since returning. Not methodically. In the evening sometimes, or in the early morning before a shift. Reading through the entries in sequence, following my own handwriting through the 5 days, the observations do not resolve into anything. Each individual entry is explicable. The sequence of them does not explain into anything. I have considered all the available frameworks: exhaustion, isolation stress, perceptual pattern seeking, mild hypnagogic episodes, GPS equipment issues, local acoustic phenomena, normal wildlife behavior misread through sensitized attention. All of these are still available. None of them are unavailable. What I keep returning to is not any single event. It is the duration of the birch grove. 39 minutes. I have walked through that grove perhaps 30 times in 9 years of Sector 9 patrols. The physical feature, a quarter-mile grove of old-growth yellow birch, has never taken more than 10 minutes to walk, and usually less. I did not stop on October 9th. I did not sit down. I did not become confused about direction. I entered from the west and exited from the east, on the same trail tread without any deviation. 39 minutes of elapsed time that my own body does not account for. I keep looking at the photograph I took of the GPS screen at the fire tower foundation position on October 9th. The coordinates, 35.9961 core N, 82.8089 core W. These are identical to 4 decimal places with the coordinates I recorded at the same location on October 6th. I have checked this 4 times since returning. There are people who work these ridges for decades without incident of any kind, and who would look at my October field notebook and find nothing in it worth discussing. There are people in the same profession who would read it differently. I have no interest in the second category of response. I am not trying to create a record that reaches toward a conclusion. I am trying to create a record that is accurate. The most accurate single sentence I can write about the 5 days in Sector 9 is this: I do not know what I experienced. 2 weeks after returning from the patrol, I drove back up FR 8116 on an off day. I want to be precise about my reasons. I was not trying to verify anything. I was not intending to walk the sector again or conduct any kind of informal investigation. My stated reason to myself was that I wanted to retrieve a tent stake I had left at the Rib Branch campsite, a long titanium stake that I had accidentally left when breaking camp on October 9th and which I had been meaning to recover. This was a real stake, and I had genuinely left it. I parked at the Ivester Gap trailhead at 9:15 a.m. on October 22nd. The trees had lost another 2 weeks of leaves, and the hardwood canopy was thin enough that the light through the forest had a different quality. Less filtered, more direct, the slopes visible through the canopy in ways that weren't visible in early October. The temperature was 36 FF and the wind was from the northwest. I walked into the Rib Branch campsite. I found the tent stake approximately where I had left it. I put it in my pocket. I stood at the campsite for about 15 minutes. I walked to the bedrock shelf at the creek. The shelf was clean. The silt and sand had been disturbed by the intervening rainfall and the circular impressions were gone. I walked south to the use path junction. The cairn of 3 flat rocks was where it had always been, slightly off the trail on the left, on a shelf of exposed rock. I looked at it for a while. It was exactly where it was. I was standing in the position I had been standing when I looked at it on October 5th, approaching from the south. It was to my left. It should have been ahead of me, standing there on October 22nd, approaching from the same direction. The cairn was ahead of me and slightly left. The trail geometry placed it the way I had first expected it to be, not to the side, ahead. I stood there for a long time. I tried to reconstruct the exact geometry of my October 5th approach. The trail curves, the elevation change, the precise moment I had stopped and looked. I could not fully do it. Memory is not geometry. I could not say with certainty whether the cairn's position on October 5th had been genuinely anomalous or whether I had simply misread the trail curve in my fatigue. I have no way to know. I knew that when I turned and walked back out. I drove back to the district office. I did not file anything about the visit. I have not been back to Sector 9 since. It is now late November, and I am sitting at my desk in the district office after a routine patrol day on the lower access roads. The heat is on and I can hear the wind outside, a real wind, 35 miles per hour from the northwest, the kind that strips the last leaves from the ridges and makes the old building creak along the north wall. The weather station on the desk says it's 27 SF at the ridge stations. I have been trying to decide whether to submit a supplemental unusual occurrence report for the October 4-9 patrol. The district's unusual occurrence protocol requires documentation of safety-affecting observations, wildlife encounters outside normal parameters, infrastructure incidents not covered in the standard assessment report, and conditions suggesting need for further investigation. The language in the protocol is broad enough to potentially include what I observed. The language is also broad enough to exclude it. I have filed 2 such reports in 14 years, and both times there was a clear physical event to describe: a washed-out emergency shelter drainage in one, and a section of trail that had been systematically damaged by what was later identified as a maintenance crew working with incorrect maps in another. What I have from October 4/9 is not a clear physical event. It is an accumulation of small observations, each individually explainable, whose combined effect I cannot adequately put into language appropriate for an official document. I have been writing this extended account instead, not for submission, for my own record. There is one more thing I have not written down anywhere, until now. On the night of October 7th, waking from the silence at 11:43 p.m. and lying in the tent waiting for the sound to return, I saw something through the tent's mesh window panel. Light. A single dim point of light, approximately 45 degrees above the horizon to the northeast. The direction of the upper ridge, not the moon. The moon had set before midnight and I had noted its absence when I went to sleep. Not a star. It was moving, slowly, horizontally, at a constant slow pace that covered about 15 degrees of arc over the 2 minutes I watched it before it passed behind the ridge canopy and disappeared. I had no explanation for this that I was satisfied with. Aircraft are visible at these elevations frequently, but aircraft lights blink and show multiple colors and move at the speed of aircraft. This was a single dim point, white-yellow in color, moving at a pace that was too slow for aircraft and too purposeful for a drifting object. It did not blink. It moved with a steadiness that felt, and I am aware of how subjective this is, intentional. The one explanation I kept returning to was a headlamp. A person carrying a headlamp at the ridge crest, moving northeast along the ridge, at approximately 11:45 p.m. after a day of rain and a night temperature below freezing. I thought about the boot prints in the clay on the north-facing descent. Downhill only. I thought about the music near the lower fire road. I thought about the movement at the edge of my visibility on the art lobe on October 7th, which I had logged as a deer. I am not assembling these observations into a conclusion. I am placing them in sequence for the first time in this document, having kept them separate in the field log. I want to be precise. I have no reason to believe they are related. I have no reason to believe they are unrelated. What I know is this: someone, or the impression of someone, seemed to be present in Sector 9 during my patrol. Or the sector produced, for whatever reason, consistent sensory impressions that were shaped like someone's presence. These two possibilities are not distinguishable from the evidence I have, and I don't know which one is more disturbing. I submitted a partial supplemental report on November 4th, after sitting with this for the better part of a month. The report noted the GPS discrepancies, described them as possible equipment issues, and recommended a GPS calibration check for the unit I had been issued. It noted the presence of boot prints in the clay at the Cold Mountain Gap descent and recommended increased permit check monitoring for Sector 9's northern access corridor. It mentioned the radio frequency irregularity on October 5th and noted possible interference from adjacent commercial operations. It did not mention the Birch Grove timing. It did not mention the light. It did not mention the silence. It did not mention the sentence in my notebook about the sector having changed. The GPS unit came back from calibration with a note saying it was within tolerance. The permit monitoring recommendation was acknowledged and filed. The radio interference was noted as consistent with known district frequency issues. Everything I reported was addressed. Everything I didn't report is unaddressed. I know these mountains. I have spent enough time in their hollows and on their ridges and in their fog to understand that they do not require explanation and do not offer it. The Appalachians are old enough to have become genuinely indifferent to the distinction between what is and what seems. They have been folding and eroding and holding their silences since before there were people to hear them or rangers to document what they heard. I think about the sector almost every day. Not with fear exactly, with attention. The way you pay attention to a thing that has informed you, in a language without words, that your understanding of it has a limit you hadn't previously located. I have requested standard winter rotation through the mid-elevation access sectors. I have not submitted a return assignment to Sector 9. This has not been questioned. I expect at some point to go back. These ridges are my responsibility and my work, and in some way that has become harder to articulate since October, something that I am not entirely free of. You spend enough years with a landscape and it becomes part of the way you know yourself. And when the landscape does something you cannot explain, you lose some degree of both things simultaneously. The field notebook from October 4/9 is in the top drawer of my desk at home. I have not opened it since October 22nd. I have not been able to explain away the 39 minutes. I have not been able to explain away the coordinates. I am not trying anymore to explain them away. The duty roster lists me as Backcountry Ranger Goalie District, and the assignment line reads only late season trail assessment and shelter check, Cranberry Wilderness, 4 days, solo. That is the official version. I am putting the rest of it here because the official version no longer feels like enough. And because writing it down is the one procedure that has not failed me yet. My name is on the cover of the incident notebook the way it has been for 14 years. I am 41. I came to the Forest Service after 7 seasons on a wildland fire crew, carried a wilderness first responder card that I renew without thinking about it, and I know this district the way a person knows the floor of a house they grew up in, by the feel of it in the lightless hours when the eyes are useless. I have walked the cranberry country in every weather it owns. I have replaced more trailblazes than I can count, dragged blowdown off switchbacks that wash out every spring, and logged more nights in the backcountry shelters than in my own bed during the busy stretch of the year. I say all of this not to sound capable. I say it because capability is exactly the thing that came apart, and I wanted on the record that I started this patrol as a man who trusted what he saw. The task itself was ordinary. A late storm had pushed through the high spruce 3 weeks earlier, and a hiker had reported a washout on the lower section of the trail that climbs out of the glades plus blowdown blocking the spur to the North Fork shelter. My job was to walk the loop, document the damage with photographs and GPS marks, assess the shelter for the coming winter, and note any sign of unauthorized camping. 4 days was generous for the distance. I packed for 6 out of habit, 40 pounds, give or take, with the radio, the topographic quad folded to the right panel, the GPS unit I do not fully trust, the camera, 2 liters of water with the filter for refills, the small stove, and the Greenfield notebook that holds everything I have ever logged out here in a hand that has gotten worse over the years. I left the truck at the Cranberry Trailhead at 6:14 in the morning. I wrote that time down before I shouldered the pack, because the first rule any of us learn is that the mountain does not keep your records for you. The air was the kind of cold that the high country holds into the early part of autumn, wet and close, smelling of spruce resin and the rot of last year's needles. Fog sat in the low ground over the glades, not moving, the way it sits when there is no wind to give it anywhere to go. I checked in with dispatch at 6:20. Reception at the trailhead is reliable, the only place on the loop where it is. I gave my call sign, my route, my expected return, the standard exchange. The dispatcher read it back. I clipped the radio to my shoulder strap, set my watch against the truck clock out of an old superstition about drift, and started up. The first 2 miles are nothing. The trail follows an old fire road grade through second-growth hardwood, gentle, the footing good even where the storm had thrown branches across it. I cleared the small stuff with the folding saw and left the large trunks marked for a crew. I drank water on schedule. I noted the temperature, the cloud, the absence of other boot prints in the soft places. It was a Tuesday in the shoulder season. I did not expect company, and I did not find any. By 8:40, I had reached the place where the grade ends and the real climb begins, where the hardwood gives way to the first of the spruce, and I stopped to eat and to write, and everything in the notebook up to that point is the steady, slightly boring record of a man doing his job well. I want to be honest about the boredom. It matters later. The early part of any patrol is a kind of meditation, a long stretch of small correct actions, and the mind goes quiet inside it. That quiet is where the first thing reached me, and I almost did not register it as a thing at all. The climb into the spruce is the part of this country I have always liked best, and the part I will not walk again. The trail leaves the hardwood and enters a band of red spruce that crowds in close on both sides. Old trees with the lower branches dead and gray, the ground beneath them carpeted in needles that take the sound out of your boots. It is darker in there even at midday, not the absence of light so much as a green dimming, and the temperature drops a few degrees the moment you cross under the first heavy crown. The fog that had sat in the glades behind me began to move up through the trees as I climbed, in slow propeller turns the way it does when the day starts to warm the lower ground and the cold air slides off the high ridge to meet it. I have watched that exchange 100 times. It is one of the most beautiful things this forest does. I climbed steadily. The switchbacks here are cut into shale, and the shale was wet, and I placed my feet with the care the surface demands. I stopped at each marked junction to confirm the blaze and write the time. 9:32 at the lower junction, 10:11 at the spring crossing, where I refilled one bottle and ran it through the filter and noted the flow as normal for the season. The water came off the rock with the steady, complicated sound that running water makes, a sound with a dozen small voices in it. And I stood there longer than I needed to, the way you do, letting it fill the space. It was somewhere above the spring that I first heard the knock. A single dull report, wood on wood, off to my left and a little behind, up the slope where the spruce thickened. It is not an unusual sound in a forest. A dead branch lets go and strikes a living trunk on the way down. A tree leans on its neighbor in the wind and the two grind together. I did not even break stride. I logged it out of completeness because I log everything, and I wrote the time as 10:48 and the note as single knock, upslope left, likely deadfall. Then it came again. The same dull report, the same volume, from very near the same place. That gave me a small pause, because deadfall does not usually repeat from one spot. But there are explanations, and I reached for them without effort. A loose branch swinging against a trunk in a breeze I could not feel down in the trail cut. A woodpecker working a dead snag, though the sound was too low and too flat for that. I stood and listened for a third, and a third did not come. And after a minute I went on. I am setting it down exactly as it happened so that no one reading this can accuse me later of building drama where there was none. There was no drama. There was a sound in the woods that I explained and kept walking, and that is all there was for a while. By noon I had gained the ridge. The trail runs along the spine of it for a stretch, and on a clear day you can see across the whole drainage to the far wall of spruce on the next ridge over, a green so deep it goes blue a distance. There was no clear day. The fog had come up to meet me, and the view was a wall of white maybe 40 feet out, and the trail ran into it and out of it as the white shifted. I ate the rest of my food sitting on a rock at the high point, drank, checked the map against the GPS, and confirmed I was where I believed I was. The two agreed. I wrote 12:9, ridge crest, visibility 40 feet, fog, no wind, and under it, in the same flat hand I have used for 14 years, no birds. I had not noticed the silence arrive. I only noticed that it was there. I have spent enough time alone in the high country to know it sounds the way you know the breathing of someone sleeping next to you. There is always something. The spruce holds its own kinds of life, and even on a still day in the shoulder season there is the scratch of a junco in the low branches, the far complaint of a raven working the ridge, the small dry rustle of something moving in the needle litter. The water is always somewhere. The wind, when there is wind, has a particular voice in the spruce crowns. A long hush very different from the rattle it makes in bare hardwood. On the ridge that noon there was none of it, not reduced, gone. I sat with a piece of food halfway to my mouth and I made myself catalog the absence the way I would catalog any observation, because cataloging is what keeps a person steady. No bird song, no insect noise, though the season was late enough that the insect noise had mostly ended anyway. No wind in the crowns, which made sense because there was no wind, and no water, which did not make sense because the spring I had filled at was below me and a creek ran the bottom of the drainage on my right, and I had never once stood on that ridge without hearing water somewhere in the distance. I told myself the fog was doing it. Fog is dense, and dense air carries sound strangely, sometimes muffling it, sometimes throwing it. It was a thin explanation, and I knew it was thin even as I wrote it down, but it was an explanation, and I have learned that the difference between a person who stays functional in the backcountry and a person who does not is whether they keep reaching for explanations or stop. I kept reaching. I packed up. I went on along the ridge toward the descent to the North Fork shelter, and as I left the high point the small sounds came back one by one, a junco somewhere, the needle litter rustle, and at last, far down and to the right, the creek. I felt the relief of it in my chest, and I distrusted the relief even then. The knock returned in the late afternoon. I had dropped off the ridge into the spruce again, and the light was going gray-green toward the early dusk that the deep timber brings on well before the sky is finished. I was perhaps a mile from the shelter spur. The knock came from upslope and behind, the same dull wood-on-wood report I had logged in the morning, the same volume. I stopped. It came again. I counted the gap between the two, and it was close to 4 seconds. A third came, and the gap was 4 seconds again, near enough that I could not tell the difference. And that was the thing that put the first real cold into me, because deadfall does not keep time. I stood very still in the trail, and I listened with everything I had. The forest around me had gone quiet again, the same way it had on the ridge, the small life of it pulling back. The knocks continued, evenly spaced, 4 seconds apart, from a fixed point upslope that I could not see for the spruce and the failing light. I counted 9 of them. Then they stopped, and they did not resume. I wrote 542, repeated knock upslope left, even 4-second spacing, 9 repetitions, source not located. I wanted to write a cause, and I did not have one, and I left the line blank where the cause should go. And that blank line is the first place in 14 years of notebooks where I left a cause unwritten. I went on to the shelter. There was nothing else I could do. The protocol does not have an entry for a sound that keeps time. The North Fork shelter is a 3-sided log structure with a raised sleeping platform and a stone fire ring out front. The standard build for this district, set in a small flat clearing where a feeder creek comes down to meet the main fork. I reached it at 6:31 in the evening, in the last of the usable light, and the blowdown the hiker had reported was real. 3 good-sized spruce across the spur trail that I marked for a crew and then climbed over. The shelter itself was sound. I noted the roof, the platform, the condition of the logs, the bare cable strung between 2 trees a proper distance off. There was no sign of recent camping. The fire ring held old, rain-flattened ash and nothing newer. I did the evening the way I always do it. I set my pad and bag on the platform, hung my food and anything scented on the bare cables, filtered water from the feeder creek, and got the small stove going for a hot meal because the cold was settling in fast. The routine is a comfort. Each task has a place and an order, and moving through them is like reciting something known by heart, and I leaned on that hard after the day I had had. By full dusk I had eaten and cleaned up, and I sat on the edge of the platform with the radio to make my evening check-in. The shelter is in a hole as far as reception goes. I expected static and a poor connection, and that is what the protocol assumes, which is why the evening check-in from the backcountry is not required to be a clean exchange, only an attempt logged at a set time. I keyed the radio at 7:58 and gave my call sign and my position and my status, all nominal, shelter sound, route on schedule. What came back was static, the long broken hiss of a signal that cannot find purchase. And that was expected and fine. But inside the static there were fragments. There are always fragments in radio noise if you listen for them. The mind builds words out of randomness the way it builds faces out of clouds, and I know that. And I told myself that. But these did not feel built. They came in the cadence of speech, in a voice, low and even, surfacing for a syllable or two out of the hiss and going under again. I could not make out words. I caught the rhythm of words, the rise and fall of a sentence, the pause where a sentence ends and another begins. I keyed again and asked dispatch to repeat. More static. More of the cadence inside it. Once, near the end, I am almost certain I heard my own call sign return to me, the letters and the number in the right order, in that low, even voice, very far down under the noise, almost certain. I have turned it over enough times now that I no longer trust the memory, and I am writing what I believed in the moment, which is that something said my call sign back to me through a radio that could not have carried a clean signal out of that hole. I logged 7:58, evening check-in attempted, reception poor, fragmentary audio and static, unable to confirm contact. I did not write that I had heard my call sign. I told myself it was not confirmed and therefore not a log entry, and that was true. And it was also the second time that day I had decided not to write something down, and I noticed myself noticing it. I slept badly. The feeder creek ran all night a few yards from the platform. A steady, close sound, and at some point in the lightless middle of the night I came up out of a thin sleep with the certainty that it had stopped. I lay still and listened. The creek was running. It had not stopped, but the certainty had been total, a physical thing, and I lay awake a long time afterward listening to water that was plainly there and could not shake the feeling that I was being allowed to hear it. Morning came gray and wet. The fog down in the clearing this time, beaded on the bag and on the outside of the shelter logs. I made coffee, ate, broke camp, and reloaded the food onto my body. I felt the dull flatness that a poor night leaves, and I named it to myself plainly, because fatigue is the first and best explanation for everything that goes wrong in the backcountry, and I wanted it on the table. I had slept 4 hours, maybe 5 in pieces. A tired man hears things. A tired man misjudges. I would account for the fatigue and I would do the work. The plan for the second day was to finish documenting the shelter spur, then continue around the loop to assess the washout on the lower trail before climbing back to the ridge and the descent to the truck on the third day. Straightforward. I have walked the loop in 2 days when the trail is clean, and the only complication this time was the storm damage, which meant photographs and marks and a slower pace. I started up the spur to photograph the blowdown in daylight at 7:20. The spur is short, perhaps a quarter mile, climbing from the shelter clearing to rejoin the main loop at a marked junction. I had climbed it the evening before in the failing light over the 3-down spruce, and the junction at the top had the standard sign, an old routed wooden board on a post with the loop directions and mileages burned into it. I reached the junction at 7:38 and the sign was wrong. I do not mean it had been vandalized or had fallen. I mean the arrow that should have pointed left toward the washout and the lower trail pointed right toward the high ridge, and the arrow that should have pointed right pointed left, and the mileages had followed the arrows so that the board read, calmly and permanently, the opposite of the country it stood in. I know that junction. I have stood at it a dozen times. The lower trail goes left and down. The board said it went right and up. I stood there for a while. Then I did the careful thing. I took out the map and the GPS, and I established my position by the terrain itself, by the fall of the land and the line of the creek and the contour I was standing on, and the terrain agreed with the map and both disagreed with the sign. The lower trail went left and down. I confirmed it 3 ways and I was certain. Signs get replaced by crews who make mistakes. A board could have been mounted reversed by someone in a hurry, or carved wrong at the start, and I could have walked past it a dozen times in good conditions and read the country instead of the board without ever noticing the board was lying. That is a real thing that happens. I held on to it. I photographed the sign. I wrote 7:38, loop junction, directional sign reversed relative to terrain, possible installation error, navigating by map and ground, and I went left and down, the way the land told me to. And the cold place in my chest from the evening before had not gone away with the morning the way I had hoped it would. I keep returning, when I read this back, to how reasonable I was. Every single anomaly had its explanation ready, and every explanation was true, and not one of them was enough, and I went on into the country trusting the ground under my feet because the ground at least had never once lied to me. That was the morning of the second day. The ground had 2 more days to teach me otherwise. The lower trail drops through a long band of rhododendron before it reaches the main fork crossing, and the rhododendron is the part of this forest that most resembles a thing built to confuse a person on purpose, though it is only a plant doing what plants do. The branches grow in dense low arches, gray and smooth, woven together into tunnels that the trail bores through. And inside those tunnels the light goes flat and the sound goes strange, and you can see no more than a few yards in any direction off the path. We call the worst of it the Laurel Hells, an old name, and the name is fair. A person who steps off the trail in a rhododendron thicket can lose the trail in 30 feet and spend a day fighting back to it through branches that do not break and do not bend. I came down into the rhododendron at 8:50 and the wildlife sound thinned out as I descended, the way it had on the ridge, until by the time I was deep in the tunnels there was nothing but my own boots on the wet trail and my own breathing and the creak of the pack. I expected the creak to grow louder as I dropped toward it. The main fork was below me and to my left, falling down its bed in the bottom of the drainage, and the sound of it should have built steadily as I descended, the way it always does, until at the crossing it would be loud enough to talk over. It built. but it built on my right. I want to be precise about this because it is the kind of thing that sounds like nothing written down and was not nothing standing inside it. The creek was on my left. The map put it on my left. The fall of the land put it on my left. The trail was cut into a slope that dropped away to the left toward the water and rose to the right toward the ridge I had come down from. And the sound of running water was coming from my right, from upslope, from the high ground where there was no water and could be no water, growing louder as I descended as though I were walking down toward a creek that ran along the top of the ridge above me. I stopped in the rhododendron tunnel, and I closed my eyes, and I turned my head slowly to locate the source by ear, the way you are trained to, and every time I settled on it, it was upslope and to the right. I opened my eyes and looked down to my left where the land fell away, and through a gap in the branches I could see the pale movement of the actual creek in the bottom, 50 or 60 feet below me, running where it had always run. I could see the water. The sound of the water was coming from the opposite side. There is a real phenomenon here. In a tight, hard-walled space like a rhododendron tunnel, sound reflects, and a person can be fooled about direction, especially a tired person, especially in fog. I knew that. I made myself say it out loud. Alone in the tunnel, my voice flat and small in the dead air. Acoustic reflection. Tired. Fog. I said it and I did not believe it the way I needed to, because acoustic reflection scrambles direction. It makes a sound seem to come from everywhere or from the wrong angle in a confusing way, and this was not confused. This was clear and steady and wrong. A creek running confidently along a ridge where the ground was dry, and the real creek below me running silent. I logged it. 924, creek audio displaced to upslope right, visual confirmation of creek downslope left, cause undetermined. I was running out of room in the cause column. I went down to the crossing. The crossing was where it should be. The water at the crossing made the right sound from the right place, loud and close and full of its small voices, and I filtered a bottle there and drank and stood in the only honest sound I had heard in an hour, and I was grateful for it and afraid of how grateful I was. The washout was beyond the crossing, where the lower trail traverses a steep side slope above the main fork, and it was bad. The late storm had cut a slide that took out 40 or 50 feet of tread and left a raw chute of mud and shale dropping straight to the water. It was the actual reason I was out here, the one thing on the patrol that was simple and physical and unarguable, and I was almost glad to reach it. I spent an hour on it, photographing from above and below, marking the extent with GPS points, sketching the slide in the notebook with measurements, noting the soil and the angle and the hazard to hikers. It was good work and it was real. And while I did it, I was a ranger doing a job and nothing was wrong. I crossed the slide carefully on the upslope edge where the ground still held, and I went on, and the trail climbed back toward the long traverse that would eventually take me up to the ridge again. According to the map and according to my own memory of the country, the traverse from the washout to the base of the ridge climb is about 1.25 miles. An hour of walking at the pace the terrain allows, maybe a little more with the photographing and the marking. I left the washout at 11:40. I walked the traverse. I walked it at a steady working pace, stopping only to clear 2 small blowdowns and to drink on schedule. And the trail was clear and the footing was good and I had no reason to slow. The traverse runs along a single sustained contour, a clean line on the map. No junctions, no real navigation, the kind of section you walk without thinking. I walked it without thinking, the way you do, the mind going its own quiet places, and when I came up out of that quiet and checked my watch at the base of the ridge climb, it read 3:15 in the afternoon, 3 hours and 35 minutes. For 1.25 miles on clear trail at a working pace with 2 small blowdowns and a few water stops, I sat down on a rock at the base of the climb and I did the arithmetic 3 times because I did not believe it. I checked the GPS track. The unit had logged the distance as a little over 1 mile. The traverse, the one I had just walked, no more. It had logged the time. The two did not fit. 1.25 miles does not take 3.5 hours unless a person is hurt or lost or stopped for a long while, and I was none of those things. I had not stopped. I had not sat down. I had not been hurt or confused. I had walked a clear trail at a normal pace, and somewhere inside the walking, somewhere inside that quiet the mind goes to, more than 2 hours had gone that I could not account for and did not remember passing. There are explanations. A tired man's sense of time is unreliable. I had slept badly. The mind left to wander on an easy section loses track of the passage of minutes, and a person genuinely cannot say afterward whether an hour or 3 has gone. That is true. People misjudge time on the trail constantly, but they misjudge it by a margin, by a stretching or a compressing of a known interval, and they do not misjudge a 1-hour walk into a 3.5-hour walk while logging a 1-hour distance on the GPS. The distance and the time told 2 different stories, and both of them were recorded by instruments, and I had no third story to reconcile them with. I wrote 3:15 base of ridge climb. Traverse distance per GPS approx 1.1 miles. Elapsed time from washout 3 hours 35 minutes. No stop, no incident, no memory of elapsed interval. Cause undetermined. The cause column on that page is a column of the same 2 words over and over. And I sat at the base of that climb in the gray afternoon, and I felt, for the first time, not the cold in the chest but a real fear. The kind that has weight, because a man can argue with a sound. A man cannot argue with 2 hours that are simply gone. I made a decision at the base of the ridge climb, and I want it on the record because it was a procedural decision made by a rational man, and I would make it again, and it did not help. The decision was this: document only, do not investigate, complete the patrol, descend on schedule. The protocol for unusual observations is to record and report, not to pursue. I am not a person who goes looking. I had a washout assessed and photographed, a shelter checked, a sign error logged, and a route to finish. And the right thing, the trained thing, the thing 14 years had built into me, was to keep moving through the procedure and get myself back to the truck and the road and the place where the radio works, and let someone with more than my own tired senses decide what any of it meant. I would not climb the slope to find the knocking. I would not stop to study the displaced water sound. I would walk and write and come out. I climbed the ridge. The climb took the time it should have taken, near enough. And I checked my watch at the top with a kind of held breath, and it was a little under an hour later, 4:09. And the relief of that ordinary hour was so large that I understood how far I had already slipped. A man should not be grateful that an hour took an hour. The plan had been to descend a short way off the far side of the ridge to a small designated tent site near a reliable spring, camp there, and finish the descent to the truck the following morning. The tent site is below the crest on the leeward side, sheltered, a flat bench in the spruce with the spring 100 feet down a side path. I reached it at 4:40 with light to spare, and I set up the same way I always do: the pad and the bag, the bear hang, the water, the stove. The fog had lifted some on the ridge, and for the first time in 2 days I had a real view down into the drainage I would descend in the morning, the spruce going down and away into the early evening, ridge after ridge of it fading to blue. I was filtering water at the spring at 7:20 in the evening, in the last of the gray light, when I saw the light across the valley. It was on the far wall of the drainage, the next ridge over, well up the slope. A steady point of pale yellow-white light where I knew with complete certainty there was no road, no structure, no trail, no reason for a light. I know that country. The far ridge is trailless spruce backed by more trailless spruce, miles of it, no fire road within the drainage, no cabin, no lookout, nothing. I have stood at that spring in the dusk before and looked across at that ridge and seen exactly what should be there, which is a dimming wall of trees and nothing else. The light did not flicker like fire. It did not move like a headlamp on a person, the bob and sway of a walker. It held still, steady, the way an electric light held in a fixed mount holds still. A single point at a distance I could not honestly judge, because judging distance across a foggy drainage at dusk is exactly the kind of thing the eye does badly. It could have been close and small. It could have been far and large. It held for the length of time it took me to filter a full bottle and cap it and stand up several minutes, and I watched it the whole time, and it did not change. Then the fog moved across that part of the far ridge the way fog does, and when the fog passed the light was gone, and it did not come back, though I stood at the spring until I could no longer see the far ridge at all. I logged it. 7:24. Fixed white light, far ridge, no road or structure known in that location. Distance indeterminate, No movement, obscured by fog after several minutes, not seen again. I held to my decision, document only. I did not cross the valley. There was no way to cross the valley that did not involve descending into trailless laurel hell in the gloom, which is a thing that kills experienced people. And I was not going to do it, and I am telling you that the not doing took an effort I did not expect, because some part of me, some tired and frightened part, wanted very badly to know what was making a light where no light could be, and wanting to know is how people disappear out here. The second night was worse than the first, and I knew going into it that it would be. The way you know a wound will hurt more the second day. I lay on the platform of sleeping pad and bag on the flat bench with the spruce close around and the spring running its small, steady run down the side path, and I could not get under. Sleep would come close and then some part of me would jerk back from it, alert, listening, and I would lie there with my eyes open in the lightless hush cataloging the sounds the way I had been trained to and the way had become by then a compulsion I could not put down. The spring. My own breath, the settle and tick of the cooling ground, the far occasional shift of a branch. I named each one as it came and I waited for the absence because I had learned by then that the absence was the thing to watch for, and twice in the night the absence came. The first time, near 11 by the watch I kept checking, everything stopped at once. Not faded, stopped, between one breath and the next. The spring and the settling ground and the branches all gone together into a silence so complete that I could hear the blood in my own ears. A high, thin sound that is always there and that you only notice when there is nothing else. I lay rigid in it. It held for what the watch later suggested was about 4 minutes, though I did not look at the watch during, because I could not make myself move. Then the spring came back, mid-run, as though it had never paused, the small voices of it picking up exactly where they had left off. And the branches and the ground with it, the whole forest resuming at once like a held breath let go. I checked my notebook by headlamp afterward, which is the compulsion I mentioned. The compulsive note-checking that I can see now was the deterioration showing itself in a habit I trusted. I read back over the day's entries, the times, the observations to anchor myself, and I found that I could not always match the entries to my memory of writing them. They were in my hand. They were correct as far as I could verify against the map and the GPS, but several of them I had no memory of writing, and one of them, the entry for the displaced creek sound, was written in a hand slightly steadier than the entries around it, and I sat with the headlamp on that line for a long time, because a man's handwriting gets worse when he is tired and frightened, not better, and that one line was better. I want to be careful here, because this is the place where a reader will decide I came apart. And I do not think I came apart. Not then. A sleep-deprived man's memory is unreliable in exactly this way. You do automatic things and do not retain them. You write a log entry the way you tie a shoe, without the mind attending, and afterward there is no memory because the mind was never there. That is real and it is documented and I knew it. I held to it. But knowing the explanation did not make the silence less total, and it did not put back the 2 hours from the traverse, and it did not steady my hand the way that one line was steadied, and I lay awake the rest of the night doing arithmetic on the times in my notebook and getting answers I did not like. The second silence came near 4 in the morning, in the lowest part of the night, and it was shorter, and during it very far off, from no direction I could fix, I heard the knock. Once. Dull. Wood on wood. In the total silence it was the only sound in the world, and then the silence took it back and the forest resumed and I lay still until the gray came up through the spruce and gave me permission to stop pretending I would sleep. I broke camp at first usable light and started the descent at 6:40. And I will be honest that I started it fast, faster than the footing wanted, because every part of me wanted to be down and out, and it took a deliberate act of will to slow myself to the pace the wet shale demanded. A man who hurries on that ground falls, and a man who falls alone out there does not always get up. I made myself slow. I made myself drink on schedule. I made myself stop at the marked points and confirm the blazes and write the time. The procedure was all I had left, and I held it like a rail. The descent runs back down through spruce and then into the long rhododendron band again. And it was in the rhododendron, perhaps an hour down, that I began to hear the footsteps. They were behind me and to the side, off the trail in the thicket, and they kept pace with me. Not the random crash of a deer breaking through, which is loud and panicked and brief, not the heavy, unhurried push of a bear. These were footsteps, the regular alternating fall of something walking, deliberate, matched to my pace, and when I stopped, they stopped. And when I went on, they went on, and the gap between us did not change. I stopped 3 times to be sure. 3 times the sound that paced me stopped within a step of my own stopping and held in the silence and then resumed when I resumed. There is no animal in these mountains that paces a person like that. A deer flees. A bear that is following you, which is rare and serious, does not match your stride and stop when you stop. It closes or it veers off. It behaves like an animal with its own purpose. This kept exact pace in the rhododendron where I could see nothing off the trail more than a few feet into the gray arching branches where a person could not have walked off trail at my pace without fighting the thicket and making a great deal of noise. And there was no fighting and no thrashing, only the clean regular fall of steps in cover that should have made clean regular steps impossible. I tried the explanations. Echo of my own boots thrown off the dense rhododendron walls and delayed enough to sound like a second walker. That is a real acoustic effect, and I have heard versions of it, but an echo of your own steps stops the instant you stop, with no walking gap, and these had a gap, a half-second of continued walking after I had already planted and stilled, the sound of something taking one more step because it had not yet registered that I had stopped. An echo cannot take an extra step. An echo has no lag of its own intention because it has no intention. I did the trained thing and I made noise. I called out, the loud flat hail you give to make your presence known to a bear or a hunter, identifying myself. Forest Service, anyone there? My voice went into the rhododendron and the rhododendron took it and gave back nothing, no echo even, the dead flat acoustic of the tunnel swallowing it whole, and the footsteps neither answered nor fled nor closed. They simply held, off the trail, in the silence after my voice, and when I gave up and walked on, they walked on, pacing me, and they paced me for the better part of a mile until the rhododendron opened out near the lower creek, and then, between one step and the next, they were not there anymore, and I was alone on the trail in the ordinary sound of a forest with birds in it, sweating cold through my shirt, having logged nothing because my hands would not hold the pencil steady enough to write and I no longer trusted what they would write if they could. I stopped at the lower creek to make myself drink and to make myself write because not writing had begun to feel like a kind of falling and the notebook was the floor. I sat on a stone in the honest sound of running water and I forced my hand to record the footsteps, the pacing, the failed hail, the time, 8:55. The writing steadied me a little, the way it always had, and when I had it down I made the mistake of cross-checking my position, and that is where the country itself stopped agreeing with me. The Lower Creek crossing is a landmark I have used for years. There is a particular boulder in the middle of the flow, a great pale slab the size of a vehicle, split down the center by a crack that a young birch has grown out of, roots gripping both halves. Everyone who works this district knows that rock. It is on no map, but it is in all of our memories, the marker that tells you the crossing is the right crossing and the trail beyond it is the trail home. I have photographed it. I have eaten lunch on it. I crossed there my first season and I have crossed there 100 times since. And the boulder with the birch in the crack is one of the fixed and certain things of my working life. The boulder was there. The birch was there, growing out of the crack. But the crossing was on the wrong side of it. I need to explain why this is not a small thing. The trail comes down to the creek, the boulder sits in the flow, and the trail picks up on the far bank downstream of the boulder, always downstream, so that the rock sits upstream of the crossing line and you keep it on your right hand as you wade across heading home. That is fixed. That is geography. I have crossed there 100 times with that rock on my right, and I stood at the water that morning and the trail picked up on the far bank upstream of the boulder, so that to follow it I would have to keep the rock on my left, and the whole crossing was mirrored, reversed, the way the junction sign had been reversed, the way the creek sound had been reversed. The same wrongness, in the one place in this forest I would have staked my life on knowing. I took out the map. The map does not show the boulder, but it shows the trail and the creek. And the trail crosses and continues downstream, and that agreed with my memory and disagreed with the ground in front of me. I took out the GPS. The GPS showed me a point on the trail at the crossing, where I should be, where I was. It did not show me which side of a boulder I was standing on. No instrument I carried could resolve it. because the instruments know the trail and the contour and they do not know the rock. And the rock was the thing that was wrong, the small certain human memory thing. Mirrored, I will tell you what I told myself, and it is thin, and I knew it was thin. Memory is fallible. I had crossed that creek 100 times, but the specific orientation of a boulder, the which side of it, is exactly the kind of detail the memory does not store reliably. It stores the gist, the rock, the birch, and reconstructs the rest, and reconstructs it wrong as often as not. People misremember the layout of their own kitchens. I could have had the orientation backward in my memory for years and never been tested on it because I never had to consult it. I just crossed. That is possible. I held to it the way I had held to all of them, and I crossed the creek with the rock on my left, against everything my body believed, and my body fought me the whole way across, certain it was walking into the water on the wrong line, and the far bank was solid under my boots, and the trail was the trail, and it took me home, or it took me toward home, which by then were not the same thing. The radio came back to life on the climb out of the lower creek, and I wish it had stayed dead. Reception improves as you gain elevation toward the trailhead ridge. And I keyed dispatch at 10:30 for a position check, expecting the broken signal of the lower country and hoping for enough of a window to log a clean contact. What I got was not static, it was a clear channel, clearer than that section of trail has any right to provide. And on the clear channel was a voice, low and even, the same cadence I had heard inside the static at the shelter 2 nights before, except now there was no static to hide inside. And the voice was reading. It was reading my notebook. I do not know how else to say it. The voice on the radio, in the flat, even tone of someone reading aloud from a page, was speaking the entries from my field notebook, the observations in order in my words. The single knock upslope left likely deadfall, the repeated knock with even 4-second spacing, the creek audio displaced to upslope right, the traverse, the elapsed time, the cause undetermined. It read them in the order I had written them, including the entries I did not remember writing, and as it read it reached the entry for the light on the far ridge, and then it reached the entry for the footsteps in the rhododendron that I had written an hour before at the lower creek, that no one had heard me write, that existed only in the green notebook zipped inside my jacket against my chest. I took the radio off my shoulder strap and I held it in front of me and I watched it speak. And I will tell you that I checked it for a stuck transmit, for crossed signals, for any of the ordinary radio failures that can put a voice where it should not be. And the volume knob was where I had left it, and the channel was the district channel, and the voice went on reading my own words back to me in a forest where I was alone. When it reached the most recent entry, the footsteps, it stopped. It did not say anything after. It went to static, the ordinary broken static of that section, as though it had read everything there was and had nothing further until I gave it more. I turned the radio off. I had never turned the radio off in 14 years of patrol. The radio stays on, that is the protocol. The radio is the lifeline. I turned it off and I put it in the bottom of my pack and I made my decision, the second real decision of the patrol, and it was the only one left to make. Evacuate, now. Direct line to the truck. No more documenting, no more stopping at the marked points, no more confirming blazes, just up the climb to the trailhead ridge and down the front side to the road and out, as fast as the ground would let me move without falling. I logged one last entry, standing there, in a hand I could barely control. 10:34, terminating patrol, evacuating to trailhead, radio disabled. I did not write what the radio had done. I think I did not write it because some part of me understood that the notebook was the thing being read, and I did not want to give it the page. I closed the book and zipped it away and I climbed. The climb out should have taken 2 hours. I am writing down what it did instead, and I am aware that everything from here is the testimony of a man at the edge of what his senses could be trusted to report. And I am writing it anyway because it happened to me and because no one else was there to correct me. The trail out climbs through spruce to the trailhead ridge in a series of switchbacks I have walked so many times I could climb them in the lightless gloom and have. There is a sequence to them, a rhythm, a particular long switchback near the top where the trail doubles back across a small spring seep. And after the seep there are 4 short switchbacks and then the ridge and then the front side descent to the road. I know that sequence the way I know the stairs in my own house, the count of them, the feel. I climbed. I reached the long switchback at the spring seep. I crossed the seep, the wet rock, the small trickle. I climbed the 4 short switchbacks above it, and I came to the long switchback at the spring seep and crossed the seep, the wet rock, the small trickle, and climbed the 4 short switchbacks above it and came to the long switchback at the spring seep 3 times. I am certain it was 3 times, though certainty is the thing I had the least of by then. The same seep, the same wet rock, the same trickle in the same place, the same 4 switchbacks above it, and each time the 4 switchbacks delivered me not to the ridge that should have been at the top of them but back to the seep at the bottom, as though the trail had been folded and joined to itself, as though I were climbing a stair that returned to its own first step. The GPS, when I made myself look at it the 3rd time, showed me gaining elevation, the track climbing, the numbers rising, a clean ascending line, and the ground delivered me to the same seep with the same trickle, while the numbers said I was higher than I had ever been on that trail, higher than the ridge, higher than the country goes. I stopped trying to reconcile it. There was nothing to reconcile it with. I did the only thing left, which was to leave the trail. The trail was folding me back on itself, and the trail could not be trusted, and so I turned uphill, straight up, off the trail, through the spruce, climbing the fall line directly toward where the ridge had to be, because a ridge is a physical thing and the fall line does not lie even when the trail does. The spruce was thick and the climbing was brutal, and I fought up through it on hands and knees in places, and the forest around me had gone into the total silence again, the complete absence, no spring, no wind, no bird, no sound but my own breath tearing and the scrape of my own body against the trees. And somewhere in that silence, keeping pace below me and to the side, the footsteps had come back, unhurried, walking the fall line up behind me as I clawed up it, never closing, never falling away, and I did not stop to listen for the gap this time. I climbed, I came out onto the trailhead ridge at a place I did not recognize, broke out of the spruce onto the open crest, and the truck was there. The truck was below me on the front side, at the trailhead, in the gravel pullout where I had left it 4 days before, exactly where it should be. And the sight of it broke something in me, and I went down the front side at a run that was nearly a fall, the open trail of the front side flying under my boots. And the footsteps did not follow me out of the spruce, or if they did I was making too much noise to hear them, and I reached the truck and put my hands on the cold metal of it, and it was real, it was solid, it was the most solid thing I had touched in days. I checked my watch. It read 11:48 in the morning. I had logged the start of the evacuation at 10:34, the climb that had folded me back on itself 3 times, the off-trail fight up the fall line on hands and knees, the descent down the front side at a run, had taken 1 hour and 14 minutes by the watch on my wrist. I did not believe the watch, so I checked the truck. The dashboard clock read 11:49. I turned the key to accessory, and the radio in the truck, the broadcast radio, the ordinary one, came on to a station out of the valley town, and the announcer gave the time as 11:49 and the date was the 4th day, the day I was due out, the right day. Everything agreed. The watch, the truck, the broadcast station, all of them agreed that it was late morning on the 4th day, and that the evacuation had taken 1 hour and 14 minutes. And inside that hour and 14 minutes I had climbed the same 4 switchbacks 3 times and fought up a fall line I could not have fought up in 1 hour and run down a front side. And there was no room in 1 hour and 14 minutes for what I had done, the way there had been too much room in the 3.5 hours of the traverse. I drove out. I want to record that I drove carefully, that I was not in shock in the way that makes a person dangerous behind the wheel, that I checked my mirrors and signaled at the empty forest road junctions out of 14 years of habit. I drove down the gravel and onto the county road and toward the district office, and the whole way down I kept the broadcast radio on, the ordinary station, the announcer, and the valley music, because it was the sound of the world being the world, and I needed it. And twice on the way down the station dropped into static for a moment the way mountain reception does, and both times in the static, before I could stop my own ears from doing it, I listened for the even low voice, and both times the station came back clean, and it was only ever an announcer, only ever music. And I do not know whether that was a mercy or whether I had simply driven out of range of the thing that reads. I turned in a report. I am required to, and I did. And the report is accurate as far as it goes, which is not far. It documents the washout with photographs and coordinates and measurements. It documents the blowdown on the shelter spur marked for a crew. It documents the condition of the North Fork shelter as sound for the winter. It notes a directional sign at the loop junction installed in reverse relative to the terrain and recommends correction. It is a good report on those things, a professional report, and on those things it can be trusted. And a crew has since been sent to the washout and to the sign, and I am told the sign was indeed found reversed and that they have set it right. The report does not document the rest. I left the rest out. I want that on the record here in this private accounting because the omission is itself the most honest thing I can tell you about what I believe happened to me out there. I left out the knocking and the silences and the displaced water and the missing hours and the surplus hours, the light on the trailless ridge, the footsteps that paced me, the voice that read my notebook, the trail that folded back on itself at the spring seep. I left them out because I have no cause to write in the cause column, and a report without causes is not a report, it is a confession, and I am not ready to confess to something I cannot name. I requested reassignment. The request is in. I cited accumulated time in the backcountry and a need for front country duty, which is a reason a man my age can give without anyone looking at him strangely. And it was granted without question, and I have not been back into the cranberry wilderness since, and I have told the office I will not take the loop again, and I have not told them why. I check the trailhead conditions sometimes on the system from my desk, the way you press a tooth that aches to see if it still aches. It still aches. I have read this account back more times than is good for me, looking for the place where a rational explanation holds the whole thing together. The single cause that would let me file it and close it and sleep. Fatigue. Sleep deprivation. The known tricks of fog and rhododendron and mountain acoustics on a tired mind. Each one explains a piece. Not one explains the whole, and the whole is what I carried out of there. The whole is what paced me up the fall line. The whole is what read my notebook back to me in my own words on a clean channel where there should have been only noise. I still keep the green notebook. I should have turned it in or burned it, and I have done neither. It sits in a drawer at home, and most nights I do not think about it. But there are nights, the low ones, near 4 in the morning, when the house goes quiet in a way that is too complete, when the refrigerator hum and the settle of the walls and the wind in the eaves all stop together between one breath and the next, and in that silence I lie still and I listen, and I wait to find out whether the next sound I hear will be the world resuming the way it always has, or whether it will be a single knock, dull, wood on wood, from somewhere in the house that has no wood to knock, asking me the way it asked me on the ridge whether I am still listening. I do not know yet which it will be. I do not think I will know until it comes. The blaze on the posted deep gap had loosened sometime over the winter, and I was kneeling in the wet leaf litter with 2 screws held between my lips when I first heard it. A single knock, low and flat, coming from the slope below the trail. I did not turn around. After 14 years of patrol work, I have learned that the first sound is almost never worth turning around for. A branch settling against another branch, a limb dropping under its own weight in the fog. The Black Mountains are full of small reports like that, and a person who flinches at every one of them does not last a season up here. I should explain who I am, because the report I filed later did not leave room for most of this, and the parts it did leave room for I chose not to include. I am a backcountry ranger with the Pisgah District, 41 years old, and this past October marked my 14th year carrying a radio along these ridges. My assignment that week was routine. Clear winter blowdown from the Black Mountain Crest Trail between Deep Gap and Silo Knob, remark any blazes that had faded or come loose, and log trail conditions ahead of the spring permit season. 3 days, 2 nights at the old patrol shelter near Cattell Peak. Nothing about it should have stayed with me. I finished seating the screws and pressed my thumb against the post to test it. Solid. The elevation at Deep Gap is right around 5,700 feet, and even in late morning the cold sits in the gap like water in a bowl. My breath came out gray. I wrote the time in my field notebook, 10:42 a.m., and a short line beneath it. Blaze resecured, Deep Gap Junction, post stable. I have kept that habit since my first year. If it is not in the notebook, it did not happen, and the notebook does not argue with you the way memory does. The knock did not come again. I listened for a moment longer than I needed to, then shouldered my pack and started north along the crest. The trail here runs through dense Fraser fir and red spruce, the kind of high forest that exists in only a few places this far south. A leftover from a colder age that the mountains have been holding on to since the ice pulled back. The trees grow close and wind-bent, and the trail tunnels through them in long green corridors where the light goes soft and dim and the ground stays damp through the driest summer. Moss covers everything that does not move. The air smells of balsam and wet bark and the particular mineral cold of standing water. By 11 I had reached the first real blowdown, a red spruce maybe 60 feet long lying square across the trail. I logged it, 11:09 a.m., large spruce down, crest trail north of Deep Gap, will require saw crew, and set about clearing what I could by hand. The work is good work. It empties the head. For the better part of an hour I cut and dragged and stacked, and the only sounds were my own breathing, the rasp of the folding saw, and somewhere down the western slope the thin, constant whisper of Boland's Creek finding its way toward the South Toe River far below. It was when I stopped to drink that I noticed the silence. Not a dramatic silence. I want to be precise about this because precision is the only honest tool I have. The creek was still there. The wind still moved in the high fir. But the small layer of sound that should have been underneath all of it, the chickadees and the kinglets and the occasional raven complaint that follow a person along this ridge in any season, that layer was simply absent. I stood with the water bottle halfway to my mouth and waited for it to come back the way you wait for your ears to clear after a loud noise. It came back. Maybe 90 seconds later a raven called from somewhere east, 2 rough notes, and a kinglet answered it, and the ordinary world resumed. I drank, capped the bottle, and told myself what I would tell myself many times over the following days. A front was moving in. Birds go quiet before weather. Any ranger who has spent a winter in these mountains has felt that hush settle in before a storm, and it means nothing except that you should check the sky. I checked the sky. Through the gaps in the canopy it had gone the flat pewter color that means rain by evening. I made a note. 12:18 p.m., weather building from west, birds quiet, expect precipitation, and I did not think about it again until much later, when I was sitting in my truck at the trailhead with the heater running and could not make my hands stop shaking. The rain held off longer than I expected. I made good distance through the early afternoon, clearing 2 more small blowdowns and remarking 4 blazes that the weather had bleached almost to bare wood. The crest trail does not give up elevation easily. It runs the spine of the range, dipping into gaps and climbing back over the knobs, and a person walking it spends the whole day going up and down without ever really getting anywhere on the map. Mount Craig, Big Tom, Cattail Peak, each one over 6,500 feet, each one a slow grind through fir so thick that for long stretches you cannot see more than 10 feet to either side of the tread. I reached the shoulder of Mount Craig at 2:51 p.m. and stopped to do a radio check. We are required to check in twice daily on backcountry patrol, morning and evening, and once more if conditions warrant. The reception up here is poor and unreliable. The ridges throw the signal, and in the gaps you get nothing at all, so you learn the spots where the radio will reach the repeater on Mount Mitchell. The Craig shoulder is one of them. I keyed the handset. Mitchell Base, this is Crest 3, radio check over. The reply came back thin and scratched with static but readable. Crest 3, Mitchell Base, I have you weak but clear, go ahead with conditions. I gave my position, my progress, the blowdowns logged for the saw crew, and the weather building from the west. The dispatcher that day was a man named Reyes who had worked the base station for as long as I had worked the trail. He read it all back, confirmed my plan to overnight at the cattail shelter, and told me the front was tracking faster than forecast. Rain by 4, he said, heavy after dark, clearing by morning. Then he said something I did not catch, 2 or 3 words swallowed by static, and the carrier dropped. Mitchell Base, say again your last, over, I said. Nothing. I waited, keyed again, waited. The static had a texture to it, a kind of layered hiss with what almost sounded like a rhythm underneath, the way you hear words in a fan or an engine if you listen too long. I have heard that effect 1,000 times. The brain is a pattern machine, and it will build speech out of pure noise if you give it enough seconds. I keyed once more, got a clean acknowledgement from Reyes, who had heard nothing strange on his end, and signed off. 2:58 p.m. he wrote, and so did I. Radio check complete. Craig shoulder, front arriving early. It was while I was clipping the handset back to my pack strap that I heard the footsteps. I want to be careful here because this is the kind of thing that sounds like exactly what it was not. They were below me and behind me down the slope on the eastern side in the steep fir where there is no trail and where the ground is a tangle of deadfall and root and slick rock that no person would choose to cross. The cadence was even, a heel-toe placement, deliberate, the sound of someone walking who knows how to walk in the woods, not the four-beat scramble of a bear, not the light double tick of a deer, a two-beat human walk, paced and patient, holding to a line parallel to mine, maybe 40 feet downslope. I stood absolutely still. The footsteps continued for perhaps 8 or 9 paces, then stopped. When I moved, they did not resume. When I held still and counted to 60 in my head, nothing came. I went down the slope a little way, carefully, calling out the way you do, identifying myself as a ranger, asking if anyone needed assistance. The fur closed around me, wet and silent. There were no tracks in the soft ground. There was no one. The likeliest explanation, the one I wrote in the notebook, was acoustic. The crest trail does strange things with sound. A person walking on the tread above me, a section hiker out early, could throw footfalls down into the gap where the geometry of the slope made them seem to come from below. I had heard the trail play that trick before, though never quite so cleanly. I wrote, 3:11 p.m., footsteps east slope, no sign, likely acoustic carry from trail above, and I climbed back up to the tread and walked the next quarter mile faster than I needed to. There was no one on the trail above me either. But that did not have to mean anything. People move. By the time I looked, whoever it was could have been around the next bend. The rain found me an hour short of the shelter. It came the way mountain rain comes, not as a front you can see approaching, but as a thickening of the fog until the fog itself was wet and then was rain, the boundary between the two impossible to fix. Visibility dropped to the length of the trail corridor and then to less. I pulled the hood up, settled into the rhythm of it, and kept walking. Wet weather does not frighten me. I have spent more nights soaked through on this ridge than I could count, and there is a kind of peace in it once you accept that you are going to be uncomfortable for a while. The cattail shelter sits a few hundred feet off the crest on a bench of flatter ground, an old 3-sided structure of stone and timber that the Forest Service has maintained since before my time. It is not on the public maps. It was built for fire crews and patrol rangers, and most hikers walk past the faint side trail without ever knowing it is there. I reached it at 5:34 p.m., soaked to the knees, and got out of the rain with the particular gratitude that only comes after a long wet day. The shelter was as I had left it on my last rotation in September. The same swept stone floor, the same metal-lined box where we keep a little dry tinder and a few candles, the same logbook on its nail by the entrance. I lit the lantern, changed into dry layers, and got water going on the small stove. The rain drummed on the roof and ran in sheets off the open front, and beyond it the world had gone to gray and then toward the long dim of a mountain evening. I did my evening radio check at 6:02 p.m. The signal from the shelter is marginal, but I caught Reyes on the second try. I reported my arrival, my condition, my plan to clear the northern section toward Cello Knob in the morning. He confirmed, told me the heavy rain would taper around midnight, and wished me a dry night. The exchange was ordinary in every way, and I logged it, and then I made my dinner and ate it, watching the rain and feeling, for the first time that day, entirely at ease. The logbook is what changed the evening. I had opened it out of habit, to add my own entry, the way every ranger does. The last entry before mine should have been my own. From September, a short note about a clogged spring box that I remembered writing. It was there, but there was an entry beneath it, after mine, dated 3 weeks back, in early October, in handwriting I did not recognize. The hand was small and even and pressed hard into the paper. It read, simply, "He walks the lower line. Do not answer him." I read it 3 times. There was no name, no ranger designation, no condition report, none of the things a proper log entry carries. Just that one sentence. I sat with the book open on my knees and felt the day rearrange itself slightly. The footsteps on the east slope coming back to me, and I made myself stop. People write things in shelter logs. I have read marriage proposals in them. and trail rumors and the long unhinged confessions of hikers who have been alone too many days. The line about the lower line meant nothing. Some thru hiker with too much time and a taste for atmosphere had written it to spook the next person, and the next person was me, and it had worked a little, and that was all. I copied the entry into my own notebook, because documentation is the habit that keeps the head honest. 6:40 p.m., anomalous prior log entry, see transcription, likely hiker, and then I closed the book and did not open it again that night. The rain kept on. I slept poorly, which I attributed to the cold and the wet, and twice I woke certain that the rhythm of the rain on the roof had paused, as if something had stepped under the eave and stopped the fall of the water. But each time I lay still and listened, the rain was only rain. Morning came gray and dripping and quiet. The front had moved through in the night as promised, but it had left the fog behind, a thick wet ceiling sitting right down on the crest so that the fir trees 10 feet off vanished into nothing. I made coffee, did my morning radio check at 7:18 a.m. with some difficulty, and logged the conditions. Fog dense, visibility under 30 feet, ground saturated, proceeding north to Silo Knob to assess trail. I want to record the state of my mind that morning because everything that came after depends on it. I was rested enough. I was not frightened. The shelter log entry had become, overnight, a small absurd thing, the kind of detail you tell people about over a beer. I felt the ordinary mild reluctance of a person leaving a dry shelter for a wet trail, and nothing more. The crest trail north of Cattail runs along a narrow ridge before dropping into a saddle and climbing again towards Silo Knob, which at 6,300 feet is the last great knob before the trail descends off the high range entirely. I know this section. I have walked it more times than any other part of my patrol, and I could draw the sequence of its switchbacks and rock steps and the one exposed shale traverse from memory. That familiarity is why the first wrong thing registered at all. There is a marker post at the Cattail saddle, a 4x4 with a metal trail sign bolted to it indicating distances north and south. I have leaned my pack against that post 100 times. In the fog, I came down to the saddle expecting it on my left where it has always stood, and it was on my right. I stopped. I looked at it for a long moment. The sign read correctly. The distances were correct. The post was the same weathered post, but it stood on the eastern edge of the saddle, and in 14 years of memory it had stood on the western edge. I did the sensible things. I checked my compass to confirm I had my directions right. North was where it should be. I considered that the trail crew might have moved the post during a relocation, but I would have been notified, and the ground around its base showed the same old moss and settling as always, no fresh dig. I considered that my memory was simply wrong, that I had carried a flipped image of the saddle in my head for years and never had cause to test it, and this is genuinely possible. Memory is not a recording. We rebuild it each time, and the rebuild drifts. I wrote it down. 8:31 a.m. Cattail saddle marker recalled west side, found east side. No sign of relocation. Memory error likely. The word likely was already doing more work than it should have, and some part of me knew it, and I ignored that part because it was the part with no evidence behind it. I went on. The fog stayed thick. I cleared a few branches, remarked one blaze, and reached the shale traverse around 9. The traverse is the one piece of this section that demands attention. A 40-foot crossing of loose flat rock above a steep drop, where in wet weather you place each boot with care and listen to the stone shift and click beneath you. I crossed it the way I always do, slow and deliberate, and on the far side I stopped to drink and to let my heart settle. That was when I noticed that the click of the shale behind me was still going. I had stopped moving. I was standing still on solid ground with the water bottle in my hand, and behind me, back across the traverse I had just finished, the shale was clicking and shifting under the weight of careful footsteps, the same slow, deliberate placement I make myself, one stone settling against another in the unmistakable sequence of a person crossing loose rock. The fog made it impossible to see the traverse. I called out, "Ranger here, identify yourself." The clicking stopped, not gradually, the way a real crossing tapers as the walker reaches solid ground, but all at once, mid-sequence, as if the weight had simply lifted off the rock between one step and the next. I waited. I called again. Nothing came across the traverse. No figure resolved out of the gray. After a few minutes I went back, carefully, and crossed the shale a second time in reverse, and there was no one on the other side, and there were no fresh marks on the wet stone except the ones my own boots had left. I am a rational person. I have built a life and a career on being the steady one, the one who does not lose his head when a hiker is lost or a storm comes in early or a search drags into a second cold night. So I reasoned. Sound carries strangely in fog. Dense fog can act on sound the way water does, bending and reflecting it, and the saturated rock and the close-walled fir corridor could conceivably have thrown the click of my own crossing back at me with a delay, a kind of acoustic echo I had simply never noticed before because I had never stopped at exactly that spot in exactly that fog. It was a reach. I knew it was a reach even as I wrote it, but it was a reach in the direction of the explainable, and that was the direction I needed to go. 8:31 had become 9:50. I logged the shale incident, made my reasoning explicit in the notebook so that I could check it later against a clearer mind, and pushed on toward Silo Knob. The fog did not lift. If anything, it thickened, and the day took on the timeless quality that heavy fog gives the high country where there is no sun to track and no view to mark progress and the world is reduced to the few feet of wet green trail directly ahead. I reached what I believed was the base of the silo climb around 10:30. The trail there begins a series of switchbacks up through a band of older spruce. 6 switchbacks, I have counted them on every patrol for years. 6, and then a short rocky pitch to the summit clearing. I started up. I counted as I climbed the way I always do, because counting steadies the mind in fog. I counted 7 switchbacks, then an 8th. Then I stopped, because there should have been 6 and I had climbed 8, and the summit pitch was not yet in front of me. The trail simply continued to switch back up through spruce that all looked identical in the gray. I stood there with my hand on a wet trunk and counted my own breath and told myself that in fog a person loses track, that I had probably miscounted, that the difference between 6 and 8 switchbacks was the kind of error any tired ranger makes on a featureless climb. I went up 2 more. 10. The summit pitch was still not there. The spruce went on. I will tell you what I did, because it is the only part of this I am still proud of. I did not panic, and I did not keep climbing. Climbing on faith is how people get truly lost. I stopped, took out my GPS unit, and waited for it to acquire a position under the fog. The GPS took longer than usual, the canopy and the cloud both working against it, but it locked. The coordinates it gave me placed me on the silo climb, at an elevation of 6,100 feet, which was consistent with where I believed myself to be. The summit lay roughly 400 feet of climbing above me. According to the instrument, I was exactly where I should be, partway up a normal climb, and the only thing wrong was the number of switchbacks I had counted, which the instrument had no way to measure and which therefore did not exist as far as the official record was concerned. This is the trap of that kind of day. The instruments agree with the reasonable story. The compass points north. The GPS gives a sensible elevation. The radio, when it reaches, carries an ordinary dispatcher saying ordinary things. Every tool I carry is built to confirm the world I expect, and every tool confirmed it. Only my own counting, my own memory, my own ears insisted on something else, and those are exactly the faculties that a tired, isolated, fog-bound person is supposed to distrust. The training is explicit on this point. Trust your instruments over your perceptions when the two disagree. I had taught that line to volunteers, so I trusted the instrument. I climbed the remaining distance, and after what the GPS told me was 400 feet of gain, the spruce thinned and the rocky summit pitch appeared, and I came out onto the Silo Knob clearing at 11:48 a.m. I had counted, from the base, 14 switchbacks. The trail has 6. I wrote both numbers in the notebook and I drew a line between them, and I did not write an explanation because for the first time that day I could not construct one that I believed. The Silo clearing is normally one of the finest places on the whole range. A high bald with the ridges falling away in every direction, and the South Toe Valley laid out below. In the fog it was a circle of wet grass perhaps 30 feet across, walled in gray with the fur at its edges fading to nothing. I stood in the center of it and listened. And the listening is when the absence came back, the same absence I had felt that first morning at the blowdown, only deeper and longer this time. There was no creek sound. At this elevation that is normal, the water is all far below, But there was also no wind in the fur, though the fog itself was drifting, which means air was moving. There were no birds. There were no insects, though even in October on a mild day you will hear something, a late cricket, the tick of a beetle in the grass. There was nothing. The fog absorbed sound the way wet wool does, and into that absorption my own pulse came up loud in my ears, and my own breath, and the small wet sounds of my own body. And beyond the edge of those sounds there was a silence so complete that it had a kind of pressure to it, as if the air itself were thicker than air should be. I checked my watch against the GPS clock. The watch read 11:48. The GPS read 12:31. 43 minutes apart. They had agreed that morning. I had checked them at the shelter. A watch can drift. A GPS clock, which syncs to the satellites, generally does not. So the sensible conclusion was that my wristwatch had lost 43 minutes somewhere in the morning, perhaps from cold, perhaps from a battery beginning to fail. I reset the watch to the GPS time, wrote down the discrepancy, 12:31 p.m., watch found 43 minutes slow, reset to GPS, and noted that I should replace the watch battery on return. This is a reasonable thing. Watches fail. I have had them fail before, but I did my radio check then, because the clearing is a reliable spot for signal, and the radio is where the reasonable story began to come apart in a way I could not paper over. Mitchell Base Crest 3, radio check over. The reply took longer than it should have. When it came, it was Reyes, and his voice was tight in a way I had not heard from him in 20 years of radio checks. Crest 3, Base, good to hear you. Confirm your status. You have been out of contact for some time. Over. I told him I had checked in at 7:18 that morning, as scheduled, from the shelter. There was a pause on his end, a long one, the carrier open and hissing. Crest 3 Base, your last contact was yesterday evening at 18:02. There has been no morning check-in. We were about to initiate a welfare protocol. Confirm you are uninjured and able to proceed. Over. I stood in the gray clearing with the handset against my cheek, and I did not answer immediately. I remembered the morning check-in with complete clarity. I remembered keying the radio at the shelter, the difficulty of the signal, Reyes confirming the front had cleared. I had written it in the notebook. I looked at the notebook open in my hand, and the entry was there in my own writing. 7:18 a.m., radio check, fog dense, proceeding north. I told him I had checked in. I read him the notebook entry. The pause this time was even longer. Crest 3 Base. I have no record of a 0718 contact. I have been on station since 0600. Are you certain of your timeline? Over. I was not certain of anything. I told him I would proceed to Silo Knob, complete the trail assessment, and return to the shelter for the night as planned, and that I was uninjured and able. He copied it, slowly, and asked me to check in every 2 hours rather than twice a day, and I agreed, and we signed off. I logged the exchange exactly, the missing check-in, his account against mine, and I sat down on a wet rock in the center of the clearing, and I held very still and tried to find the floor under my feet. Here is what I knew. Either I had imagined an entire radio conversation in detail and then written a false record of it in my own hand, which would mean that the one tool I trust above all others, my own documentation, had been compromised, or the conversation had happened and Reyes had no memory or record of it, which was its own kind of impossible, or the morning had not gone the way I remembered at all. Each possibility removed a wall I had been leaning on. The notebook was supposed to be the thing that did not argue with memory. Now it was arguing, and I could not tell which side of the argument was true. The fog had begun, very slightly, to thin. I completed the trail assessment. I want that on the record, because in everything that followed I never once abandoned the work, and the work is the only thing that kept me whole. I walked the summit area, logged 2 blazes that needed attention, noted the condition of the spring at the clearing edge, and photographed the trail junction sign with the unit camera for the maintenance file. The sign was where it should have been. The junction was correct. For perhaps 40 minutes the world behaved, and I let myself believe that the morning had been the product of bad sleep and a failing watch and the particular disorientation of heavy fog, and that the radio confusion would untangle itself when I got back to base and we compared logs side by side. The fog kept thinning as I worked, lifting off the summit in long, slow rags, and around 1:30 the first real break opened and I could see down into the valley for the first time in a day. The South Toe drainage lay below, the river a thin bright thread, the Black Mountain campground a small clearing far down where I knew it should be. The Forest Service road wound up the valley exactly where the map placed it. The world reasserted its dimensions, and the relief of it was physical, a loosening in my chest. I started back south toward the shelter at 1:52 p.m., with the fog continuing to lift and the afternoon turning toward the gold light that comes when a front has finally passed. I felt nearly ordinary. The walk back down the silo switchbacks took the time it should have taken. I counted six switchbacks, the correct number, and I almost laughed at myself standing at the bottom because of course there were six. There had always been six, and the morning fog had simply scrambled a tired man counting in the gray. The shale traverse came and went without incident. The cattail saddle marker post stood on the western edge where it belonged, where my memory had always placed it, and I stopped and looked at it for a long time and could not decide whether to be reassured or more deeply unsettled. If the post had moved back, then it had moved, and posts do not move. If it had never moved, then my morning memory of it on the east side was a false memory, generated whole, which meant my memory was producing detailed false images, and I had no way to know which of my memories were of that kind. Reassurance and dread had become the same feeling. I logged the post. I did not editorialize. 3:14 p.m., cattail saddle marker, west edge, correct. I reached the shelter side trail a little after 3:30. Did my 2-hour radio check on schedule. Reached Reyes clean and clear, reported my position and my intention to overnight. He sounded easier now, the earlier tightness gone, and told me the forecast was clear and cold through the next day. Ordinary. Everything ordinary. I want to mark this moment because it was the last time that day I felt the ground was solid. I had a dry shelter, a clear forecast, a working radio, and a completed task. The anomalies had a shape I could almost live with: fatigue and fog and a bad watch. I made my dinner. The light went gold and then amber, and then began the long, slow fade toward evening, and I sat in the open front of the shelter and watched the fur take on color and let myself be tired in a clean and earned way. Then far down the eastern slope, in a place where I knew with absolute certainty there was no road and no cabin and no person, a light came on. It was a small, steady light, warm-colored, the kind a lantern or a low window throws, and it sat down in the fur on the eastern slope at an elevation I judged to be a few hundred feet below me and perhaps a quarter-mile out. I know that country. There is nothing down there. The nearest structure on the eastern side is a private cabin far down toward the valley road, miles away and far lower, with a whole shoulder of the mountain between it and any line of sight to the shelter. No road reaches the slope below Cattail, no trail, just steep fir and deadfall and rock, the same ground the footsteps had paralleled the day before. I watched it for a long time without moving. My first thought, the trained thought, was a lost hiker with a headlamp, someone off trail and in trouble, which would make the light not a mystery but a duty. But a headlamp moves, sweeps, bobs with a person walking. This light did not move. It sat perfectly still, steady as a pilot flame, for the entire time I watched it, which by my reset watch was 11 minutes. I did the thing my job required. I keyed the radio, Mitchell Base, Crest 3. I have a steady light source on the eastern slope below the cattail bench. No known structure that location. Possible party in distress. Over. The radio gave me nothing but the layered hiss. I tried twice more. The evening signal from the shelter is poor, I knew that, but it had reached fine at 3:30. Now there was only the static with its almost rhythm underneath, and once, threaded through it, faint and broken, what could have been a voice saying a word with 2 syllables, the same 2 syllables, twice, before the carrier dropped entirely. I will not tell you what the syllables sounded like, because I am not certain, and because the brain builds speech from noise, and because writing it down would give it a solidity it does not deserve. I wrote in the notebook only this: 6:51 p.m., radio fragment during light observation, possible voice, unintelligible, unconfirmed. I considered going down to the light. Every instinct of the job pulled at me to go, because if there was a person down there in distress and I did not go, that is a thing I would carry. But the slope is genuinely dangerous in the gloom. The footing is bad, and a ranger who breaks an ankle descending toward a light he cannot confirm has turned one emergency into two. The protocol is clear, and for once the protocol and my fear pointed the same way. You do not initiate a solo off-trail descent at night toward an unconfirmed source. You document, you maintain position, you wait for daylight or for support. So I documented and I maintained position and I watched the light, and at 7:09 p.m. it did not flicker or move or go out. It simply was not there anymore, between one blink and the next. The way the clicking on the shale had stopped mid-sequence, the way the weight had lifted off the rock. I kept watching the place it had been until full dark, and the place it had been was just fur, just slope, just the ordinary lightless mass of the mountain at night. I did not sleep much. I kept the lantern low and the radio close and my boots on, and I told myself that a fire, a reflection, an aircraft beacon glimpsed through a gap, 100 ordinary things could make a light. I believed none of them, and I wrote none of them down because I had stopped. Somewhere in that long evening, being able to lie convincingly to the notebook, the night passed without the light returning, and without the footsteps, and without anything I could point to. What it did not pass without was sound. Around what my watch called 2 in the morning, the knocking began. It came from the back wall of the shelter, the solid stone wall against which I had laid my bag. A single knock, flat and low, exactly like the one I had heard that first morning below the trail at Deep Gap. Then a pause of what I counted as 11 seconds. Then another single knock, another pause of 11 seconds, another knock. The interval did not vary. I lay in the gloom and counted, and the precision of it was the worst part, because a branch knocking against stone in the wind knocks irregularly, gusting and dying. And an animal investigating a wall does so in fits and starts. Nothing in the natural world keeps an interval of 11 seconds for, by my count, 41 knocks in a row. I got up. I took the lantern and went around to the back of the shelter, into the cold and the still night air, and there was nothing against the wall, no branch overhanging it, no animal. The fir stood back from the structure on that side, and the ground between was bare swept earth with no track in it. While I stood there with the lantern raised, the knocking continued, from the wall, from the same wall I was standing beside, 11 seconds apart, and I was looking directly at the place the sound came from, and there was nothing there making it. I went back inside. I will be honest about the state I was in. I was no longer reasoning toward explanations. I had passed the point where the mind keeps offering wind and fatigue and acoustics, and I had arrived at the flat animal stillness of a person who has understood that the explanations are not coming and that the only task remaining is to get through the hours. I sat with my back to the side wall where I could see both the open front and the corner toward the knocking, and I held the radio and I waited for light. The knocking stopped at what my watch called 3:33 a.m., which I noted because the number was too neat, and which I have since wondered whether I read correctly. It stopped the way the other things stopped. Between one knock and the next, in the middle of the interval, the 40-second knock simply never arriving, the 11 seconds stretching out into silence and then into the longer silence of the rest of the night. At first light I did not make coffee. I packed in the gray before dawn with my hands clumsy from cold and from the long sitting, and I did the one thing I had been turning over all night. I opened the shelter logbook to add my entry, and I looked again at the strange line from October. He walks the lower line. Do not answer him. And beneath it, in the same small hard-pressed hand, was a second entry that had not been there 2 nights before, that could not have been there, because I had read the page closely and the page had ended with that one line. The new entry was dated with the current date. It read, "He has stopped answering." So has the other one. I did not transcribe it into my notebook. I closed the book. I have thought a great deal since about why I did not copy it, when I have copied every other anomaly with such care, and the closest I can come is that copying it would have made it part of my record, and some part of me understood that the record was the thing being written into, that the notebook in my pack and the logbook on its nail were the same kind of surface, and that I did not want to give whatever was doing the writing a cleaner page. I left the shelter at first usable light, and started south toward Deep Gap and the trail down to my truck. The morning was clear and hard and cold, the fog gone entirely, the air so transparent that the ridges stood up sharp and blue in every direction. It was, by every visible measure, a perfect day on the crest, the kind of morning that justifies the whole job. And I walked through it the way you walk through a place you no longer trust, watching the trail for changes, counting things, my eyes moving constantly to the eastern slope where the light had been and where now there was only ordinary fur lit gold by the rising sun. My morning radio check failed. Not the usual marginal failure of a poor spot, but a complete absence, the handset giving me nothing at all, not even the layered hiss, just a dead clean silence as if the radio had been switched off. Though the unit showed full battery and proper function, I tried at every spot I knew, the places where the signal has reached for 14 years, and got nothing from any of them. I logged each attempt. The notebook entries from that morning are clipped and bare. 7:40, no signal, Cattail Shoulder. 8:15, no signal, Craig Shoulder. 8:52, no signal, Big Tom. The Craig Shoulder is where the wrongness of the return announced itself fully, and it announced itself through distance, which until then had been the one dimension that stayed honest. The crest trail from the Cattail Shelter to the Craig Shoulder is a known quantity. It is by the maintained measure 1 7/10 of a mile, and it takes me at an unhurried clearing pace a little under an hour. I left the shelter at 7:09. I reached what I am confident was the Craig Shoulder, the same rock outcrop, the same view, the same junction with the faint side path at 11:40, 4.5 hours. For 1 7/10 of a mile on a clear trail in good weather on ground I have walked 100 times, I had not stopped. I had not rested beyond a minute here and there to try the radio. I had walked steadily and the trail had behaved, the switchbacks the right number, the markers in the right places, the ground familiar under my boots the whole way, and it had taken 4.5 hours, and I do not know where the time went, and the GPS when I checked it agreed that it was 11:40 and agreed that I was at the Craig Shoulder and offered no account of how a 1-hour walk had consumed an entire morning. The track log on the unit showed my path as a clean line down the crest, the correct distance, the correct route, recorded over 4.5 hours of steady walking, as if I had covered 1 7/10 of a mile at a crawl I had no memory of crawling. I sat down on the Craig outcrop. I drank water because hydration is a discipline that does not care what is happening to time, and I made myself eat. And I looked out at the valley where everything was where it should be, and I tried the radio one more time and the radio was dead. I am going to set down the rest of the return as plainly as I can, because it is the part I understand least and the part that matters most. And because the temptation in telling it is to shape it into a story with a meaning, and it does not have a meaning. It has only what happened, or what I perceived to happen, which after that morning I could no longer pretend were the same thing. From the Craig Shoulder, deep gap in the trailhead lay south, downhill, a route I could have walked blind. I started down at 11:48. The trail descended through the high fir the way it always does, dropping toward the gap where I had resecured the blaze 2 days before, and the descent felt normal, felt timed, felt like the ordinary tired walkout at the end of a patrol. The footsteps came back on the descent. The same even 2-beat human walk, this time above me and to the west, on the upslope side, paralleling my line through fur too thick to see into. They held my pace exactly. When I slowed, they slowed. When I stopped, they stopped. And in the stopping there was no settling, no tapering, just the clean cessation of weight from the ground. I did not call out. The logbook had told me not to answer him, and though I do not believe in instructions written by an unknown hand in a shelter no one visits, I found that I did not want to use my voice on that slope, that the sound of my own voice was a thing I wanted to keep close to me and not send out into the fur. So I walked, and the footsteps walked with me, parallel and patient, for the entire descent. I will not pretend I did not feel it as company, in the worst sense of that word. The mind insists on a presence to attach a sound to, and mine built one out of the cadence and held it just beyond the wall of green, neither approaching nor falling away, matched to me like a shadow thrown by something I could not turn fast enough to see. The deep gap junction appeared below me at, by my watch, 1:30. The blaze I had resecured on the first morning was there on its post, solid, correct. I put my hand on it the way I had 2 days before, and the footsteps on the upslope side stopped, and this time they did not resume, and the silence that followed was the full silence, the one with pressure in it, the one with no creak and no wind and no bird, and into that silence I stood at the junction with my hand on the post and understood that I had reached the edge of whatever the high country had become, and that one more step down toward the trailhead would either return me to the ordinary world or would not, and that there was no way to know which until I took it. I took it. The silence broke. A raven called from the east, 2 rough notes, and from below the gap, faint and ordinary, came the sound of moving water, and the wind moved in the fir overhead, and the world filled back up with the small sounds it is supposed to contain. I went down. The descent to the trailhead took the time it should have taken. My truck was where I had left it. The gate was as I had left it. The world below Deep Gap was, in every way I could test, the world I had driven up into 3 days before. The lot at the trailhead was empty except for my truck. I sat in the cab with the engine running and the heater going, and I could not for a long while make my hand stop shaking, which I record not for effect but because it was the only purely physical fact I had, the only thing happening to me that did not require interpretation. My hands shook. The heater ran. The clock on the dash read 2:51 p.m., and my watch read 2:51 p.m., and the GPS read 2:51 p.m., and all three agreed, and their agreement was no comfort at all, because I had learned by then that agreement among instruments is not the same as truth. I drove down the forest road slowly. The radio in the truck worked. I reached base on the truck unit 10 minutes down the mountain, clean and clear, and Reyes answered, and his voice was ordinary and relieved, and he logged my safe return and asked after the patrol, and I told him the trail conditions and the blowdowns for the saw crew and nothing else. I did not mention the light or the knocking or the footsteps or the 4.5 hours or the second entry in the shelter log. I told myself I would put it all in the written report where it belonged, where it could be assessed by people with clearer heads than mine. When I sat down that night to write the report, I wrote the trail conditions and the blowdowns and the blazes remarked and the spring box and the saw crew recommendation. I wrote a competent and complete trail assessment, and when I came to the section for incidents and observations, I sat with the cursor blinking for a long time, and then I wrote, minor navigational disorientation and heavy fog resolved. Watch malfunction noted, replaced. No incidents requiring follow-up. And I submitted it. I have asked myself many times why I did that, and the answers I find do not satisfy me. Part of it was that everything I would have written could be explained, individually, by fatigue and fog and a failing watch and the tricks that isolation plays, and I did not want to be the 14-year ranger who filed a report about lights that were not there and knocking with no source and time that did not add up. Part of it was the missing morning check-in, Reyes with no record of a conversation I remembered clearly, and the fear that if I wrote down everything I had perceived, the assessment would not be of the mountain but of me. And part of it, the part I trust least and suspect most, was the second log entry. He has stopped answering, so has the other one, and the cold certainty I had carried down off the ridge that to write it into the official record would be to answer, so I did not answer. I filed the clean report. And for 3 weeks I told myself it was over. It was not over, though what continued is harder to set down than what happened on the ridge, because it happened to the inside of me rather than to the world, and I am the least reliable possible witness to it. I stopped sleeping well. I would wake at what felt like a fixed time, in the deepest part of the night, certain that a sound had stopped, the way the rain on the shelter roof had seemed to stop, the way the knocking had stopped. And I would lie and listen to my own house, and there would be nothing, only the ordinary settling of a building. And after a while I would understand that the thing that had woken me was the absence of the sound, not its presence, and that I had begun to listen for silences the way I once listened for sounds. I checked my notebook compulsively. I would read back through the patrol entries, the resecured blaze, the moved and unmoved marker, the 14 switchbacks and the 6, the missing radio check, the light, and each time I read them I would feel the same vertigo, because the entries were in my hand and I did not remember writing some of them, or I remembered writing them differently, and the notebook that had been the one thing that did not argue with memory now argued constantly, and I could not tell which of us was lying. I began carrying it everywhere. I am not proud of this, photographing each page with my phone so that I would have a record of the record and then doubting the photographs. I requested reassignment. I did it carefully, citing a desire for a change of district and some lower elevation work after many years on the high crest, and it was granted without difficulty because rangers rotate and the request was reasonable on its face. I did not say that I did not want to walk the Black Mountain crest again. I did not say that the thought of the cattail saddle, of the shale traverse, of the bench where the shelter sits, produced in me a flat refusal that I could not reason with. I let it be read as ordinary career movement, and it was filed as such, and in this way I added one more clean entry to the official record over the top of everything I had not written down. The saw crew went up to clear the blowdowns I had logged. They reported the work complete and the trail in good condition. I asked the crew lead, as casually as I could manage, whether they had noticed anything unusual at the shelter, the logbook, anything. He looked at me oddly and said the shelter was fine, the log the usual hiker nonsense, and then he said one thing that I have not been able to put down since. He said the spring at the Cello clearing had gone dry, which was strange this time of year, and that the whole north section had been dead quiet, no birds the entire day, and that his newest crew member had spent the walk out swearing someone was pacing them through the fur on the upslope side, and that they had all had a good laugh about it at the trucks. I have one more thing to record, and then I will stop, because the record has to stop somewhere, and there is no natural place for it to end, which is, I think, the truest thing I can say about any of it. 2 weeks ago I drove up the South Toe Valley on a day off. I had told myself I was going to the campground, which is a public place, low and ordinary, with families and picnic tables and the river running through it. I did not intend to go up the mountain. I want that understood. I parked at the campground and I walked down to the river, and I stood on the bank in the cold, clear afternoon and watched the water, and the water sounded the way water is supposed to sound, and birds moved in the bare trees, and it was an ordinary place full of ordinary sound. And while I stood there, I looked up, the way a person does, up toward the high crest where I had spent 14 years, and the upper slopes were socked in with the first hard fog of the coming winter. A gray ceiling sitting down on the range exactly where it had sat that morning at the shelter. The crest was hidden. The whole high country was hidden under that gray, and I stood by the bright, loud river in the ordinary sunlit valley and looked up at the place where the world stops behaving, and I understood that it was still up there going on, whether I walked it or not. The fog and the silence and the careful, patient footsteps holding to the lower line, and that my not having written it down had changed nothing about whether it was true. I drove home before the light went. I did not go up. I do not believe I will go up again. And I have arranged my life so that I will not have to. And I have told no one the things I have written here, and I have written them here only because the not writing had become its own kind of pressure, the same pressure as the silence on the ridge, building. I still wake at the fixed hour in the deepest part of the night, certain a sound has stopped. I lie still and listen. There is never anything there. But I have started to notice that the listening itself has a shape now. That I am not only listening for whether a sound has stopped, but for whether, in the long interval after it stops, something is waiting the way I am waiting, counting the seconds the way I am counting them, holding to its line just beyond the wall I cannot turn fast enough to see. I do not know if it is. I have no instrument that would tell me, and I have stopped trusting the ones I have, and I have learned that the worst silence is not the one where you are certain you are alone. It is the one where you have stopped being certain. And the seconds keep going by, 11 of them, and then 11 more, and you are still counting, and you do not remember deciding to. The blade caught on the third pull, and I stopped to clear the gullet of wet spruce before I tried again. The blowdown lay across the trail at an angle, a red spruce maybe 14 inches through, snapped clean about waist height by the storm that had come through 5 days earlier. My notebook said 9:14 a.m. when I knelt to start the cut, and the air still held that cold mineral smell the high country gets after rain, when the moss is fat with water and the shale underfoot weeps a little with every step. I am 41 years old, and I have worked the backcountry of this district for 16 seasons, long enough to know that a 14-inch spruce takes patience and a sharp saw and nothing else, and I had both. I had been on the north-south trail since first light. The assignment was routine in every part. The district wanted a trail condition survey on the eastern loop before the season closed, blowdown documented and cleared where I could manage it alone, the backcountry shelter checked, the register pulled and replaced. There was one other item on the worksheet, written in Marlene's careful hand at dispatch, a soft follow-up on an overdue party report that had come in 3 weeks before and had since been marked resolved. The party had self-reported safe by phone from a trailhead 2 ridges over. The follow-up was a formality, a box to close. I had read it twice at the office and thought nothing of it. I worked the saw and let my mind go quiet the way it does on a long cut. The teeth bit, the kerf widened, and the sound of the steel running through green wood filled the small clearing in a steady rhythm, blade and breath and the soft fall of sawdust onto the duff. When the top finally rolled free of the cut and settled into the rhododendron with a heavy crush of branches, the rhythm stopped, and into the silence that followed came a single knock. It was a flat, hollow sound, wood against wood, the kind a hiking pole makes when it strikes a dead snag. Except that I was alone and my poles were strapped to my pack. I sat back on my heels and listened. The sound had come from upslope, from the laurel above the trail where the ground climbed toward the ridge, and it had carried the particular clean edge that sound gets in cold air, with nothing soft in it. I waited the better part of a minute. Water dripped from the cut log. A nuthatch worked somewhere off to my left, calling its thin nasal note. Nothing knocked again. A woodpecker, I wrote, and the time 9:31 a.m. Then I drew a line through it, because the strike had been single and final, not the drumming of a bird, and I did not want my notes to claim something I had not actually heard. I left the line blank instead and shouldered the saw. The worksheet had me at the shelter by late afternoon, and I had a long way of climbing ahead of me before then. The north-south trail climbs the spine of the wilderness in long, patient grades, and by 11 a.m. the fog had come up out of the lower hollows the way it does on these autumn mornings, rising rather than falling, pooling first in the draws and then spilling over the trail until I could see perhaps 40 feet of treadway ahead and nothing of the slopes on either side. I knew the route well enough that the loss of visibility did not concern me. I checked the GPS at the junction with the county line trail to confirm what I already knew, that I stood at 4,180 feet with another mile of climbing before the trail leveled along the shoulder of Black Mountain. I keyed the radio for my 11 o'clock check-in. Gully bass came back thin and broken, Marlene's voice surfacing through static long enough to copy my position and my plan, then dissolving again into the whitewash of dead air that the ridges make. Reception in this country is a matter of luck and geography. I had reported in, which was what protocol required, and I noted the time and the marginal signal in the log and moved on, settling the radio back into its harness against my chest where I could reach it without breaking stride. The fog changed the sound of the forest. In clear air you hear the river before you see it, the Williams running its braided channel down in the valley to the north, a steady distant rush that never stops. In fog the sound flattens and folds, and I have learned over the years to distrust direction on days like this. So when the river noise faded as I climbed, I told myself it was the fog and the rising terrain putting the shoulder of the mountain between me and the water. That is the ordinary explanation, and it is almost always the right one. I keep my pace deliberate on grades like that. A count in the legs that I have walked into them over the years, and I drink on a schedule rather than by thirst, because thirst in cold air arrives too late to be useful. I stopped at noon at a spring I have used 100 times, a thin seep that runs out of a moss bank and across the trail in a sheet too shallow to dip from but enough to fill a bottle held flat against the rock. I filtered a liter, ate a strip of jerky and a handful of almonds, and checked my feet for the hot spots that turn into trouble on the second day. The fog had not lifted. I wrote 12:18 p.m., fog persistent, river inaudible, treadway wet but stable. Then I sat for a moment longer than I needed to, listening, because the forest had gone very still, and the stillness had a quality I did not have a word for. No wind moved the spruce, no bird called, no squirrel scolded from the canopy, which in these woods is rarer than weather. I told myself that midday in late October is a quiet time in these mountains, and that was true, and I got up and kept climbing. The grade steepened above the spring where the trail leaves the seep line and switches up through a band of broken shale. This is the kind of terrain that asks for attention, the loose plates shifting underfoot, the treadway narrowing to a ledge against the cut bank in 2 places, the fog hiding the drop on the downhill side so that the eye gives you no help and you go on feel alone. I went slowly and set my poles with care and kept the saw balanced across the top of the pack so its weight would not pull me off line. By 12:50 p.m. I had cleared the shale and come out onto the gentler ground of the upper drainage, where the spruce grows taller and the duff lies thick and soft and quiet under the boots. It was somewhere along that stretch that the overdue party note came back into my mind, unbidden. The way a thing you have decided does not matter will sometimes return to ask whether you are certain. The party had been a pair, 2 men, day hiking off a side trail that branches from the loop near the head of this very drainage, a faint path that goes a half-mile to an overlook and dead ends there. They had been reported overdue by a family member, a search had been readied, and before it launched the men had phoned in from a trailhead on the far side of the wilderness, saying they had simply walked out a different way and lost track of the days. It happens, people do that. The report was closed. And yet, walking past the mouth of that side trail at 1:10 p.m., I slowed and looked down it, into the fog where the faint path lost itself among the laurel after 20 feet, and I felt no pull to follow it and a small reluctance that I could not account for, and I noted the junction in passing and walked on. It was a little after that, perhaps 1:20 p.m., that I heard the first sound I could not file. It was not the knock, it was a call, far off and low and brief. A single drawn note that might have been a barred owl, except that barred owls do not call at midday, and this was not quite the right shape for one. A sound with a human bend in it that the mind reaches for and cannot close on. It came once. I stopped and waited, and it did not come again. I wrote 1:21 p.m., distant call, unidentified, single, possibly owl, possibly acoustic. The word acoustic is one I use when I mean that the mountain folds sound in ways that fool you, valley to valley, and it is a true word and an honest one, and I used it then in good faith. And I went on toward the level shoulder with the saw balanced across my pack and the fog beginning very slightly to thin. The knock came again at 1:46 p.m., and this time I had been walking, which made it worse, because a walking man makes his own noise, and a sound that cuts through that noise is a sound that wants to be heard. I had come up onto the level shoulder of the mountain where the trail runs through old red spruce, the big ones, trees that were standing before there were rangers to count them. The fog had thinned to a gray haze that let the trunks emerge one at a time as I passed. Gray columns resolving out of the white and then sliding back into it behind me. The knock came from ahead and slightly to the right, that same flat hollow report of wood on wood, single and clean. I stopped walking, and the forest stopped with me. I want to be precise about what I did, because precision is the only thing I trust now. I stood still and I counted. At what I judged to be 30 seconds, the knock came again. From the same bearing, the same flat tone, the same single strike. At 30 seconds after that again. I took out my notebook and I timed the next 4 against the second hand of my watch. They came at intervals of 30 seconds, give or take the second or two my counting could account for, with a regularity that no animal produces and no falling branch repeats. A woodpecker drums in bursts. A branch knocking in wind knocks irregularly, when the wind moves it, and there was no wind. This was a metronome. This was something keeping time. I considered the possibilities the way I have been trained to consider them, in order, discarding each as it failed. A loose sign or trail marker swinging against a post in a draft I could not feel where I stood. A dead spar leaning against a live tree, working as the trunk flexed. Ice, except it was not nearly cold enough for ice. Some piece of human refuse, a hung cable or a length of old logging hardware, left over from the days when this whole mountain was cut for spruce and the railroad grades ran along every contour. The county line grade lay somewhere off to the right beyond the trees, an old rail bed from the logging era. And there was no telling what iron still lay rusting in its ballast. That was the explanation I settled on. The old grade and some artifact of the men who had worked it a century before, and I wrote it down, and the moment I finished writing it the knocking stopped. I waited 5 minutes by the watch. It did not resume. I made myself walk toward the bearing it had come from, off the trail and through the spruce, watching my footing on the slick needle duff, and I found nothing. No cable, no sign, no leaning spar, no iron. The old grade when I reached it lay quiet and overgrown, its ballast furred with moss, the rails long since pulled and sold for scrap, and there was nothing on it or near it that could have made a sound. I stood on it a while in the thinning fog, And then I went back to the trail and I did not write down that I had found nothing, because the not finding was a thing I did not yet know how to file. I went on toward the shelter, and I will admit that I walked faster than the terrain required. The shoulder of Black Mountain gives way on its eastern side to a long descent toward the headwaters, where the trail drops through a tunnel of rhododendron so dense that even in clearing fog the light goes greenish and close, the branches arching overhead and the laurel pressing in from both sides until the treadway is a single rutted channel a foot wide. I have always disliked that stretch. It is the one place on the loop where you cannot see more than a body length in any direction, and where the sound of your own boots comes back to you off the wall of leaves a half-beat late, the way sound behaves in a culvert. It was in the rhododendron tunnel that I noticed the blaze. The route is marked at intervals with the standard painted blazes, faded now, most of them, weathered to a pale remnant of the original color on the bark of the larger trees, the paint chalked and lifting and in places gone entirely, so that a man who did not know the route would lose it between marks after years of weather. But the blaze at the lower end of the tunnel, on a yellow birch where the trail bends left to a creek crossing, was fresh, not faded, not weathered. The paint sat bright and slightly raised on the bark the way new paint does, with a clean hard edge, and when I put my thumbnail to it the surface was firm and dry and cured to the touch, which made no sense at all, because a fresh blaze is tacky for a day and bright for a season, and this one looked painted that morning and felt painted years ago. Both at once, the freshness and the curing held together in a way the eye accepted and the mind refused. I stood at the birch longer than I should have. No crew had worked this loop in 2 seasons. I would have known. I am the one who would have done it, or signed the order for it. I photographed the blaze, noted the tree and the bend and the time, 2:39 p.m., and then I went down to the creek crossing, and the second wrong thing was waiting there, and it was the absence of a sound rather than the presence of one. The crossing is a wide, shallow ford over a tributary that comes down off the mountain loud and white. A creek you hear from a quarter-mile off. A creek that does not stop for fog or season. I could see it. The water was running, full and fast over the rocks, throwing spray, doing everything that running water does. And it made no sound at all. I stood at the edge of it with the spray landing cold on my face and my hands, watching a creek pour over stone in absolute silence, and I understood for the first time that day that I was not tired enough or stressed enough for this, and that the ordinary explanations had run out, and that I would have to keep walking anyway because there was nowhere on that mountain to stop and wait for the world to right itself. I crouched at the creek and I did the thing a rational person does, which is to test the instrument against the world. I clapped my hands once, hard. The clap was loud and sharp and exactly as loud as a clap should be at that distance from my ears, and it died in the laurel the way sound dies, with no echo, no delay. My hearing was working. I spoke aloud, my own name, and heard it plainly. Then I picked up a stone the size of an egg and dropped it into the deepest part of the channel. It went under with a splash I could see and could not hear, the white crown of it rising and falling in silence. The creek ran on, full and fast and mute. I made myself cross. The water came to mid-shin, cold enough to ache, pushing at my legs with a force I could feel in the muscles of my thighs. And I tell you that the silence of that pressure was the worst sensation I have had in 16 years in these mountains, because the body expects sound to match force, and there was none. Only the shove of the current and the cold and the quiet. On the far bank I stopped and looked back. And as I looked, the sound returned, all at once, the full roar of the creek arriving as if a door had been opened onto it, and I put a hand against a trunk to steady myself. I logged it plainly, because plain logging was the rope I was holding. 2:54 p.m. Crossing of unnamed tributary below the spruce shoulder. Temporary auditory loss at the water, duration approximately 90 seconds. Hearing otherwise normal, possible inner ear or pressure effect. Recommend medical follow-up. That is what I wrote, the medical line at the end, because it was the only frame that let me keep walking, and walking was what I had to do. The shelter lay 1.5 miles down the drainage. There was nowhere else to go that did not mean a longer night in worse country. I checked the map against the ground and the GPS against both. Confirmed 3,760 feet. Confirmed the bearing down the drainage, and went on with the river beginning to talk again somewhere below me. Loud and ordinary, exactly as it should. The shelter came into view at 4:11 p.m. A low timber and stone lean-to set back from the trail on a flat bench above the river, its roof furred with moss, its sleeping platform swept clean, the metal register box bolted to the post by the entrance exactly as I had left it the previous season. The fire ring was cold and ringed with the same stones. The bare cable hung from the same two trees. Everything about it was right, every board and stone in its place, and I stood at the edge of the bench and looked at it and wanted, very badly, for everything to keep being right. I opened the register box and pulled the logbook to do the routine, which is to confirm the last entries, replace the book if it is full, note any reports of trouble or any party that signed in and did not sign out. The book was the one I had placed the previous spring, a cheap bound notebook in a freezer bag, the cover soft now with the season of humidity. I leafed back through the year, through hikers mostly, a line or two each, names and dates and a word about the weather. A scout troop in July with a dozen signatures in a dozen sizes of handwriting. A solo woman in August who had drawn a small careful sketch of the river and signed only her first name and the word peaceful. The ordinary record of an ordinary year in a place that sees few people and remembers fewer. The last entry before the blank pages should have been weeks old. It was dated that day. I read it 3 times. The handwriting was mine. I know my own hand, the way the lowercase g hooks under the line, the way I cross a T low and hard and a little to the right, and this was my hand, beyond any question I could raise against it. And the entry was dated October the 24th, which was the day I was standing there reading it, and it gave a time of 4:11 p.m., which was the minute the shelter had come into view, and the body of the entry described the weather and the river and the condition of the trail in language that I would use, that I do use, sober and short. The river up after rain, the loop passable, the blowdown cleared on the north-south. I had not yet written any of that anywhere. I had only just arrived. I am setting this down as flatly as I can. I had not made that entry. I had been on the trail 11 miles and a mountain back, sawing a tree. At the hour the entry claimed I had been writing it here. The pen clipped inside the register box was capped and dry, the ink in it stiff, and yet the entry was there in my hand and dated correctly and timed to the minute of my arrival, and below it the page was blank, the rest of the book blank, in a way that I cannot describe except to say that it felt like a held breath, like a line left open for me to finish. I did not write under it. I could not bring myself to add a line below my own words in my own hand that I had no memory of setting down. I sealed the book back in its bag, returned it to the box, closed the latch, and sat on the edge of the sleeping platform with my back to the cold stone and the river loud and constant below me. And I told myself a long list of reasonable things about fatigue and altitude and the tricks a tired mind plays at the end of a long day on its feet, and I did not believe any of them, and the light began to go out of the fog. I set my camp inside the shelter, which is permitted and which I have done many times because the platform is dry and the stone holds a little of the day's warmth and the roof is sound against the weather. I cooked because routine is a kind of rope you can hold in deep water. I boiled water on the small stove and ate and cleaned the pot with a handful of grit from the fire ring and hung my food bag from the bear cable the way I always do, hauling it up until it swung clear well off the ground and well out from the trunk, and I noted each step in the log with the time, a record so ordinary that reading it back would let me pretend the day itself had been ordinary. 5:47 p.m. Food hung, weight approximately 11 pounds, cable sound. 6:02 p.m. Last useful light. 6:30 p.m. Fog lifting, temperature falling fast. When the fog finally lifted, it took the daylight with it. And the night that came down over the river bench was the kind of high country night that has no edges, no town glow on any horizon, no road, nothing but the band of paler sky between the black walls of spruce overhead. The river ran loud and steady, a sound I have slept to 100 nights, the one reliable voice in that country, and I lay on the platform in my bag and listened to it and waited to be tired enough to sleep, watching the faint shapes of the trees against the sky and naming the constellations I could find in the gaps. The river stopped at 9:18 p.m. I know the time because the silence woke me from the very edge of sleep so completely that I had my headlamp on and my watch in front of my face before I understood what had changed. The river was simply gone, not quieter, Gone, the way the creek had gone silent at the ford, except that now there was nothing else either. No insects, no settling tick of the cooling structure, no wind in the spruce, no sound of my own blood in my ears, which a man hears in true silence and which I did not hear, so that the silence was not the silence of a quiet place but the silence of a recording stopped. I lay in it, and it had a pressure to it, a weight against the eardrums, and I held very still, and I waited. At 9:21 p.m. the radio, which I had left on low against protocol because I wanted the company of the static, spoke. It was not static. It was a voice, fragmented, surfacing and sinking under the dead air, and it was speaking words I could not assemble into sense, the slow, even cadence of someone reading from a list. I caught, I am certain, my own call sign, Patrol 7, clear for a moment, and then gone. And then a string of numbers in the same even voice, and then a word that might have been shelter, and then the river came back all at once at full volume and the radio dropped to ordinary static. And I sat up against the stone with the headlamp beam shaking against the far wall and my heart going hard, and I turned the radio off and the night went on. I did not sleep again. I sat against the stone with the lamp on its lowest setting and the radio off and my notebook open on my knee. And I worked through the hours the only way I know, which is to take stock of what is real and can be touched. I checked the food bag from the doorway swinging clear on the cable. I checked my water, 3 liters enough. I checked the map and the route out, the loop forward by the county line trail to the tumbling rock trail and down to the river road, against the route back the way I had come. I laid these things out in my mind like gear on a tarp before a trip, counting them, and the counting steadied me, and between the counts I listened to the river run loud and right and let it be the thing that proved the world was still there. I will tell you that I considered in those gray hours simply walking out into the night, abandoning the survey, going back up and over the shoulder of Black Mountain by headlamp and down to the truck before the sun. I have walked out at night before in emergencies and I know how to do it, how to read a trail by the small cone of a lamp and the feel of the tread under the boots. What stopped me was discipline rather than nerve. You do not move alone in shale country at night with no one within radio range and a silent creek crossing in the way unless someone is dying, and no one was dying. And a ranger who flees blind into the night and goes off a ledge becomes the next search, the next overdue party, the next soft follow-up on someone else's worksheet, written out in another careful hand and assigned to someone who still trusts the ground he walks on. So I stayed. I sat against the stone and counted my gear and listened to the river and waited for the gray to come into the sky, and I made myself eat at first light though I had no appetite. Because the body does the walking and the body needs feeding whatever the mind is doing, and the mind, I had learned by then, was not to be trusted with the deciding. The gray came at last, slow and reluctant, the spruce resolving out of the night one trunk at a time, the river loud and ordinary, the fog gone and the morning promising, against all the night had been, to be clear. I packed with a speed that had nothing rational in it and everything honest. I rolled the bag and struck the stove and pulled the food and broke camp in half the usual time. And I made my final entry at the shelter, 6:31 a.m., departing, proceeding on loop via county line, all in order, the lie of those last 3 words sitting quiet on the page. Nothing was in order. But the log is a record of position and procedure, and by that measure I was in position and following procedure, and so the words were true in the only way the log requires them to be. The morning was clear. The first clear morning of the trip, and the clarity should have helped, and for a while it did. The light came down golden through the spruce and lit the moss until the whole bench glowed, and the river ran loud and right beside the trail, and for the better part of an hour the world was so plainly and ordinarily itself that I began to gather the pieces of an explanation and to fit them together as I walked. A long day on my feet. A short night, low blood sugar at the creek and the inner ear thing it can bring, a tired mind dressing the register entry in fear, finding my own hand where another season's hand had been, misreading a date in poor light, the voice on the radio a scrap of some distant transmission bent by the ridges. I am good at this, at building the reasonable account, and I had nearly built one I could stand on when I came to the first blowdown of the day and found that I had already cleared it. The blowdown lay across the county line trail a half-mile below the shelter, a red spruce of about 14 inches, snapped at waist height, and a section of its trunk had been cut clean through and rolled into the rhododendron. the cut faces bright and weeping sap, the sawdust pale and loose in the duff beneath. I knew the cut, I knew the angle of it, the slight downward slope where my arm tires near the end of a stroke, and the width of the kerf, and the way the top had crushed into the laurel when it rolled free. It was the blowdown I had cleared the previous morning, 11 miles and a full day and a mountain away on the north-south trail. I stood over it and I did the only thing left to do, which was to measure it against the truth I could prove. I had the photograph of the first cut, taken the morning before with the time stamped in the file, and I found the image on the phone, the spruce, the kerf, the crushed top in the laurel, and I held the screen up against the blowdown in front of me, and they were the same tree, the same break, the same cut, the same crushed top lying in the same arrangement of broken laurel, down to a single snapped branch that hung white and raw at the same angle in the photograph and in the world before me. The sawdust was fresh. That is the detail I keep returning to. A day-old cut weathers, the faces dulling, the dust darkening and packing down with dew. This cut was bright and weeping as though I had made it an hour before and I had made it the day before on another mountain entirely. I photographed it again, and the second photograph when I looked at it was identical to the first in every particular except the timestamp, as though the world had simply moved the tree, or moved me, or moved the day and could not be bothered to age the wound it carried along. I checked the GPS. It told me I stood at 3,690 feet on the county line trail, half a mile below the shelter, exactly where I should be. The instrument and the ground did not agree about what was possible, and I had nothing left to make them agree, so I stepped over the tree I had felled on another mountain and kept walking down a trail I had never walked before. The county line trail follows the boundary of the old survey along a low ridge, in and out of the heads of small drainages, and it is honest walking, neither steep nor easy. The kind of trail you can give your legs to while your mind works on something else. I gave my legs to it and let my mind work. And what it worked on, against my will, was distance. By 10:30 a.m., by my watch and by the count in my legs, I should have covered the better part of 4 miles from the shelter and reached the junction with the tumbling rock trail. The GPS said I had covered 1.5. I trusted my legs. 16 years in this country has given me a sense of distance walked that is rarely off by much, and it told me I had walked far, and the instrument told me I had walked little, and the trail ahead and behind looked the same in both directions, low ridge and spruce and the heads of small drainages, with nothing to fix a position by. I noticed, somewhere in there, that I had stopped hearing the woods. Not a sudden silence like the creek or the river, nothing so sharp as that, but a slow draining away of the ordinary noise that a forest makes and that you stop hearing until it is gone. No squirrels, no nuthatches working the bark, no chickadees which call in any weather and at any season in these mountains and which I have never in 16 years spent a full hour without hearing. No insects though the day had warmed, no grouse drumming, no junco scratching in the duff at the trailside. The woods had emptied of their small constant life so gradually that I could not have said when it began. And I found myself walking through a forest that looked exactly like a forest and sounded like a held breath, and I caught myself walking on the balls of my feet, quietly, the way you move when you do not want to be the only sound in a room and you already are. At 11 a.m. I keyed the radio for the scheduled check-in and got nothing, not even static, a dead silence on the channel that a radio should never give. Because even a radio far out of range hisses, even a dead channel hisses. I checked the unit. The battery showed good, the channel was correct, the squelch was set. It simply produced no sound, the way the creek had produced no sound, and after a moment I switched it off and on again, and the static returned, ordinary and almost welcome, and I called goalie base and got no answer, which at that distance was expected, and I logged my position as the GPS gave it and walked on with the distance question and the silence question both unanswered and growing. I tried, a little after that, to anchor myself against something I could trust without batteries or weather. The county line trail takes its name from the old boundary it follows, and the boundary is marked here and there by survey monuments set into the ground by men a long time ago, low stone or iron posts stamped with section numbers and bearings, the kind of mark that does not move and does not lie, that is set precisely so that a person standing on it can know exactly where on the earth he stands. I knew there was one near the head of the third drainage because I had logged it myself 2 seasons before, and I went looking for it the way a man at sea looks for a fixed light. And I found it at 11:18 a.m., an iron post canted slightly in the duff, the cap green with age, and I knelt and brushed the moss from the stamped face to read it. The numbers were stamped clean and deep and unworn, sharp as the day they were struck, on a cap that was otherwise corroded green through and through, the freshness and the age held together again in the one object, the way they had been held in the blaze on the birch. And the bearing stamped into the iron, the bearing that should have matched the survey and the map and every record the district keeps, did not match any of them. It pointed, near as I could reckon it against my own compass, back the way I had come, up toward the shelter, as though the boundary itself had turned around in the ground while I walked along it. I did not write the bearing down. I read it 3 times to be certain I had it right, and then I made myself stop reading it, and I left the monument canting in the duff with its sharp new numbers on its old green face, and I went on, and I did not go looking for the next one. The light in the hollow appeared at 11:52 a.m. The trail had swung out onto the nose of the ridge where the spruce thinned and a gap in the trees gave a view down into a drainage to the south, a deep wooded hollow with no road in it and no trail and no reason for any light to be there. And there was a light there, low among the trees, steady and pale and small, the size and the color of a lit window seen from a distance through woods at dusk. Except it was not dusk. It was midday, clear, the sun well up, and a light that reads as a window at dusk should be invisible at noon, washed out by the day, and this one was not. It held its own small, steady glow against the full light of the sun, down among the trunks where the map showed nothing, no structure, no clearing, no road, no reason. I will not pretend I did not consider going down to it. There is a reflex in this work when you see a light where no light should be, that is half duty and half the simple human pull toward another lit window in an empty country, and for a long moment I stood at the edge of the trail and looked at the way the ground fell into the hollow and thought about descending. What stopped me was not courage and not fear exactly, but arithmetic. The light was perhaps a half-mile off and 400 feet down through trailless rhododendron and blowdown, a brutal hour each way, and if it was nothing, an old reflection off water, a trick of an angle, I would have spent 2 hours and emerged in worse country with the day half gone. And if it was something, I did not want to find it alone, with a dead schedule and a radio that came and went, so I logged it. 11:52 a.m., steady light source observed in drainage to the south, no structure mapped, no road, source unknown, did not investigate, and I made myself walk on, and I looked back once, and the light was still there, holding against the noon sun, and I did not look back again. The Tumbling Rock Junction, when I finally reached it, came at 1:30 p.m., and the sign at the junction was the right sign, weathered and correct, with the mileages routed into the wood and the paint long gone from the letters, exactly as I remembered it. I stood at it with something close to relief, because a known landmark is a kind of proof, and I needed proof more than I needed water. The sign said Tumbling Rock Trail to the right, 3 1/10 miles to the river road, and the river road meant the truck, and the truck meant the end of this. I drank and ate without tasting it, and checked my feet, and turned right down the Tumbling Rock Trail, with 3 1/10 measured miles between me and the world. At 2:14 p.m. I came to a washed-out switchback where the trail doubled back on itself around the head of a steep ravine. The cut banks slumped from the storm. The treadway narrowed to a muddy ledge that I crossed with one hand braced against the uphill bank and my poles gathered in the other. I made the crossing carefully and noted it. 2:14 p.m., switchback at ravine head. Washout, treadway compromised but passable, recommend repair. And at 2:41 p.m. I came to a washed-out switchback where the trail doubled back on itself around the head of a steep ravine. The cut banks slumped from the storm, the treadway narrowed to a muddy ledge, and it was the same switchback, the same ravine, the same slump of red mud, with the print of my own boot already pressed into the ledge ahead of me, pointing the way I was already going. I knelt and looked at my own footprint in the mud. It was mine. I matched my boot to it. The lugged sole, the worn place at the outer heel where I have always worn my boots through first, and it lay in the ledge ahead of me, pointing down the trail in the direction I was walking, as though I had already passed this way going forward and was now arriving at the place I had left. There was one set of prints. They went away from me down the trail and did not come back. I had not been here before. The GPS, when I checked it, gave a 0.3 of a mile beyond the first switchback, a lower elevation, a different place, and the ground in front of me said the same place, and my own boot in the mud said I had already gone on ahead of myself, and I could not hold all three of those truths in my hand at once, so I let go of two of them and kept the boot print, because it was the one I could touch, and I stepped over it and went on. The light had begun to change. It was not yet evening, but the clarity of the morning had thickened into a high pale overcast that drained the color from the spruce and flattened the slopes until distance stopped meaning anything, and the wind, which had been still all day, came up along the ridge. I have spent enough time in these mountains to know how ridge wind behaves, the way it pours over a crest and down a slope and tells you, if you know how to listen, which way the land falls and where you stand on it. The wind that came up that afternoon poured uphill. I felt it on my face, moving against the grade, cold and steady, climbing the slope I was descending, and the spruce leaned downhill against it, away from the wind, bowing the wrong way, the way trees do not lean. Then the echoes started coming early. I would set a pole against a stone, and the sound of it would return off the far side of the ravine before the pole had struck, the echo arriving ahead of the sound that made it, by a margin too small to be certain of and too large to deny, so that every step I took came back to me a half-beat out of order, the forest answering questions I had not yet asked. I stopped walking and stood still, and the wind climbed past me uphill, and the leaning trees held their wrong lean, and I understood that I had lost the ability to tell the difference between losing my mind and the world having quietly changed its rules, and that the difference might not matter, because either way the only thing to do was to keep walking and get down off that mountain. I made the decision to abandon every part of the assignment except getting out at 3:10 p.m., and I logged it that way, because the log had become the one fixed point I had left, the one place where things happened in an order I had set and could be trusted to stay where I put them. Abandoning survey, I wrote. Proceeding directly to River Road via Tumbling Rock Trail, will not investigate further anomalies, will not deviate from treadway under any condition. And then, because I needed it to be true, I added the mileage from the sign, 3 1/10 miles to the road, as though writing the distance down would oblige the distance to behave. It did not behave. I walked and I counted and I watched the GPS, and the 3 1/10 miles became 4 and then 5 by the count in my legs, while the instrument crept forward 1/10 of a mile at a time, grudging as though I were dragging it. And the afternoon light, which should have been failing toward an October dusk by 5, held at the same flat, pale hour after hour, unmoving, as though the day itself had stopped walking when I did and would not go on ahead of me. My watch advanced, 4 p.m., 4:45 p.m., 5:30 p.m. The light did not change, the trees did not change. I passed a particular twisted yellow birch with a burl on its trunk like a clenched fist at 4:22 p.m. and again at 5:09 p.m. the same tree, the same fist of wood. And the second time I did not stop and did not photograph it and did not write it down, because writing it down would have made it a second thing and not the same thing, and I needed it to be the same thing. I needed there to be only one of that tree in the world. I kept my eyes on the treadway and my hand near the radio, and I walked. And I talked to myself, low and steady, the way you talk to a frightened animal you do not want to spook into bolting. I named the things I knew to be true. My name, aloud. My call sign, the district. The date, October the 25th, the second day, which I confirmed against the watch each time I doubted it. The truck, blue, at the river road, the keys in the left chest pocket of my shirt where I always carry them, where I could press my hand flat and feel them against my heart. I named these things and I walked, and the light did not change. And the river, when I finally began to hear it again, came up out of the silence so gradually that I could not have said when it started, only that at some point I knew it had been there a while, low and constant, growing, the way the world comes back into a room after you have stopped expecting it. The river road came at what my watch called 6:14 p.m., and the light still called late afternoon, and I came down the last pitch of the Tumbling Rock Trail out of the spruce and onto the gravel of the road in a kind of gray daze, my legs gone to wood, and the truck was there. Blue, where I had left it 2 days before, nosed into the pull-off above the ford exactly right, the windshield beaded with the night's damp, the tires settled where I had settled them, I crossed to it and put my hand flat on the hood, and the metal was cold, 2 days cold, the deep cold of a thing that has sat through 2 nights in the mountains the way it should be, and I stood there with my hand on the cold hood and felt the relief come up through me so hard and so fast that my legs nearly went out from under me, and I had to lean on the fender a moment and breathe. I want to record what was wrong at the truck because something was, and because I have promised myself to record everything, even the small things, even the things that prove nothing on their own. The river road runs along the Williams for several miles, and at that hour, even on an empty weekday evening in late October, there is sound to it, the river and the wind in the streamside sycamores, and sometimes far off the gear down of a logging truck on the hard road, or the first call of a barred owl coming on toward dusk. There was the river. There was nothing else. The trees along the road stood without moving in air that had gone perfectly still again, the stillness of the shoulder, the stillness of the creek. And in the bed of my truck, where I had left it empty and clean and swept out 2 mornings before, lay a single length of cut spruce 14 inches through, the cut faces bright and weeping sap, the sawdust pale and loose around it, as though someone had carried it down off the mountain and laid it carefully in the bed for me to find when I came out. I did not touch it. I got into the cab and shut the door and started the engine, and the ordinary roar of it was the finest sound I have ever heard in my life. A loud and stupid and entirely explainable sound, and I backed out onto the road and drove. I watched the bed in the mirror as I drove, the length of spruce lying there steady in the rocking of the truck on the gravel, and I told myself I would deal with it at the office, log it, photograph it, ask whether anyone had been up the road. I drove the long gravel miles down out of the mountains with my hands tight on the wheel and the spruce in the mirror and the light. At last, beginning to fail in a way that the clock agreed with, the dusk arriving when the dusk was due, the first honest thing the day had given me, I filed a report. I want that on the record, that I followed procedure to the end, because procedure is what I have left, and because the alternative was to file nothing. And a ranger who comes off a 2-day patrol and files nothing has decided something about himself that I was not ready to decide. The report I filed was accurate in every particular that could be measured and silent on every particular that could not. It documented the blowdown cleared on the north-south trail and the trail conditions on the loop and the washout on the tumbling rock trail and the marginal radio reception throughout. It recommended that the eastern loop be reblazed, that the backcountry register be replaced, that the tumbling rock switchback be flagged for repair before spring. It noted that the overdue party follow-up had produced no findings, which was true, because I had reached no finding about anything at all, about that or anything else. It did not mention the knocking that kept time at 30-second intervals on the shoulder of Black Mountain. It did not mention the creek that ran full and white and made no sound, or the fresh blaze on the old birch that felt cured under the thumb, or my own hand in the register dated to the minute of my arrival, or the spruce I cut twice on 2 mountains a day and 11 miles apart, or the light that held against the noon sun in a hollow with no road, or my own boot print waiting for me in the mud ahead, or the wind that climbed uphill while the trees leaned down, or the echoes that came before the sounds that made them, or the day that would not move while I moved through it, or the length of cut spruce lying in the bed of my truck. It did not mention the call I had heard at midday with a human bend in it, or the empty woods that had drained of their small constant life on the county line trail, or the survey monument with its sharp new numbers stamped into its old green iron and its bearing turned around in the ground. I left it at the edge of the district lot when I got in, that length of spruce, because I did not want it in the truck overnight, and it was gone the next morning, hauled off by someone, I suppose, though no one I asked had moved it. And I did not ask very hard, because I did not want an answer I could not file either. I requested reassignment off the eastern loop for the remainder of my time in the district, and the request was granted without question, the way such requests usually are, because every ranger who works long enough has a piece of country he will not work, a hollow or a ridge or a length of trail he trades away to someone newer. And no one asks why, because everyone has one, and the asking would only mean explaining their own. Marlene processed the change without a word about it. I have wondered since whether she read the report closely, whether she noticed the careful flatness of it, the way it walked around the center of itself, and decided, as I had decided, to leave the center alone. I have not gone back. I keep the log still, the personal one, the small notebook that is not for the district and never will be. And I read it sometimes at night, the entries in my own steady hand, the times and the elevations and the bearings, and I check the times against my memory, and they agree, mostly. And the small places where they do not agree are small enough that any tired man might have made them, a minute here, a tenth of a mile there, an entry slightly out of order. I tell myself that. I have a list of reasonable things, the same list I built walking down that bright second morning, and I go down it the way I went down the trail, naming them in order: fatigue and altitude and low blood sugar and the inner ear and the way these mountains fold sound from valley to valley, and they hold, mostly in the daylight, with the radio on and the kettle going and the ordinary noise of a house around me. It is at night that the list runs thin. When the house is quiet and the heat ticks in the walls and there is nothing to fill the room, I find myself listening the way I learned to listen on the shoulder of Black Mountain, against my will for the small constant life of a place, and noticing, the way I noticed on the county line trail, when it is not there. The refrigerator stops its cycle and the furnace holds its breath between ticks, and for a few seconds the house produces no sound at all. And in those few seconds I am back on the mountain in the held breath of it, waiting, counting without meaning to, 1, 2, 3, up toward 30, because once, not long after I came down off that mountain, on a still night with the house gone quiet between the ticks of the heat, I heard it, far off and faint and entirely impossible, through the wall, from no direction I could name, a single flat hollow knock of wood on wood, clean-edged, final, the exact sound from the shoulder and the exact sound from the clearing where I cut the first tree, and then 30 seconds of silence. I sat with my pen lifted off the page and the lamp steady and the count going in spite of me, 1, 2, 3, and I did not finish the count. I have not, in all the nights since, brought myself to sit still long enough to learn whether it comes again, whether it kept its time after the first strike, whether it was keeping its time all along and only now, in the quiet, has come close enough for me to hear. I get up instead. I turn on the radio, or the kettle, or the television, anything with a voice in it, and I let the ordinary noise come back into the room and cover the silence over, the way the river came back, the way the creek came back, all at once, as if a door had been opened. And I do not finish the count, and I do not go back to the mountain, and I do not yet know, and that is where the record has to end, because it is the truth, and the truth is that I still do not know.